Section 1. The Frozen Town. Get comfortable. Settle in. Maybe pull the blanket a little tighter, turn the brightness down, and let this wash over you. Because for the next 4 hours, we're going to wander the streets of the most famous fictional town in American history. And what we find there, underneath the cartoon colors and the laugh track and the 36 years of jokes you've probably already memorized, is something far stranger and far more interesting than anything the show has ever said out loud. This is Springfield. Population unknown. Location unknown. Ruled quietly by a man who may have been alive for over a century. Contaminated by a nuclear facility that the residents have somehow never seriously questioned. Home to a baby who may be the most intelligent person within the town's borders. A principal who stole someone else's entire life. A father who has been dead since 1993. And a recurring background character who dies so frequently that death itself seems to have given up on him. We're going to explore all of it. Every theory, every buried storyline, every piece of canonical evidence that the writers planted and the audience absorbed without fully realizing what they were being shown. We're going to take our time. There's no rush tonight. We'll move through each mystery slowly, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, letting the pieces settle before we move to the next one. And we'll start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the show exactly, but the beginning of the question that all the other questions eventually lead back to. Why doesn't anyone in Springfield age? Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since the 17th of December, 1989, the night The Simpsons debuted on Fox and changed American television in ways that are still being measured. He was 10 then. He is 10 now. He will be 10 in 10 more years, assuming the show is still running, which based on its current trajectory, it probably will be. Lisa is 8, Maggie is 1. Homer and Marge are somewhere in their mid-30s, give or take whatever the writers decided their backstory required for that particular episode. 36 years have passed in the real world. 0 years have passed in Springfield. The industry has a name for this. It's called a floating timeline. The idea is that the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When it aired in 1997, they were living in 1997. The technology updates, the cultural references shift, the jokes are calibrated to whatever is happening in the world at the time of broadcast. But the characters themselves stay locked. They don't age. They don't grow. They exist in a kind of permanent now that keeps reshaping itself to fit the current moment, while the people at its center remain completely untouched by time. Most people accept this. It's a cartoon. That's how cartoons work. The Flintstones stayed the same age. The Jetsons stayed the same age. Scooby-Doo and his friends have been solving the same kind of mystery since 1969, and Shaggy has never once grown a gray hair. Animated characters are exempt from the normal rules. They live outside time because they were drawn outside time, and asking why they don't age is a bit like asking why the Roadrunner can run faster than physics should allow. The answer is, because that's the show. Except The Simpsons is not quite like other animated shows. It's been running long enough, and in enough detail, that the floating timeline has started to create contradictions so large that they've become their own kind of evidence. The show has written specific dates, it has given characters documented birth years, it has created backstories with historical anchors, and as those anchors have been dragged forward by the relentlessly advancing present, the official history of Springfield has had to be quietly rewritten over and over again. Homer and Marge's courtship, for example, was originally set in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their high school romance had a very specific cultural texture. The music was right for the era. The clothes were right. The whole story made sense for two people who would have been in their mid-30s by the late 1980s, which is when the show began. But 36 years later, Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s, which means they can't have met in 1980. If they're 35 in 2025, they were born somewhere around 1990, and their high school years would have fallen in the mid-2000s. The show has handled this not by acknowledging the problem, but by quietly updating the flashback episodes. Over the years, there have been several different versions of Homer and Marge's origin story. Each one places their formative years in a slightly different decade. The earliest versions gave them disco and Watergate, later versions gave them grunge and early internet. More recent takes have pushed their high school years into the 2000s, complete with different music, different aesthetics, different cultural touchstones. The love story is the same. The characters are the same. But the era they inhabit keeps sliding forward because the timeline demands it. This means Homer and Marge don't have a stable past. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of a present that never changes. And if you're paying attention, if you're watching closely enough to notice when the details don't quite line up, this is one of the first signs that something unusual is happening in Springfield. Something that the show won't explain directly but keeps showing you from different angles. Now here is where the theories begin. Because there are several explanations for why nobody in Springfield ages, and they range from the practical to the deeply unsettling. And the most interesting thing about all of them is that they're not mutually exclusive. They can all be true at the same time, each one explaining a different layer of the same fundamental strangeness. The first and perhaps most grounded of these explanations has to do with the town itself, with the industry that powers it, with the water everyone drinks and the air everyone breathes, and the giant concrete structure that sits on the edge of town and hums continuously and has, according to at least one documented inspection, 342 separate safety violations. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the oldest, richest, and arguably most dangerous man in a town full of people who have never seriously questioned why a billionaire with a personal grudge against accountability has been allowed to operate a leaking nuclear facility in their backyard for decades. The plant is, by any reasonable standard, a disaster. A surprise safety inspection found those 342 violations. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to code was $56 million. Burns declined to spend it. The reasoning, to the extent that the show provides any, is that fixing the problems would mean admitting they existed, and admitting they existed would mean someone might start asking what those problems had already done to the people living downwind. The violations are not minor things. We're talking about radioactive waste being dumped into bodies of water, radioactive waste being disposed of on a children's playground, plutonium sitting on someone's desk as a paperweight, cooling towers held together with chewing gum, animals inside the facility that glow faintly in the dark. And then there are the human skeletons. In the basement of the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant, a canonical episode shows you actual human skeletons. The show does not explain who they were, how they got there, or what the connection might be between running a nuclear reactor and accumulating human remains in the basement. It just shows you the bones and moves on, and nobody in Springfield ever mentions them again. The man whose job it is to prevent any of this from happening is Homer Simpson, the safety inspector for the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. A man whose IQ, according to the show's own creator, is approximately 55. A man who, as revealed in a later season episode, has had a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function to levels that most adults would find difficult to comprehend. A man who sleeps at his workstation, who has caused at least one nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen, who is, in every measurable sense, the last person you would want standing between a leaking nuclear facility and the people who drink the water downstream. And Homer has been standing there, failing at that job, for over 3 decades. The first visible evidence that the plant is doing something to Springfield's ecosystem appears in Season 2, in the form of a fish. A 3-eyed fish pulled from a river near the power plant and named Blinky by the people who catch it. Blinky becomes national news within the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as evidence that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns, in one of the show's great moments of rich man confidence, eats the fish on live television to prove it's harmless. The town watches, the town shrugs. And nobody, not a single person, asks the question that should have been the obvious next question. If the fish have 3 eyes, what is the water doing to the people who drink it? The answer, if you accept the radiation theory, has been embedded in the show's visual design since the very beginning. Look at the residents of Springfield. Look at them with fresh eyes, the way you might look at something you've grown so used to that you've stopped really seeing it. Homer has a skull shape that doesn't correspond to any known human anatomy. Bulging eyes. A jaw that seems to exist outside the normal parameters of the human face. 4 fingers on each hand, which is presented as a cartoon simplification but within the logic of the show's own universe, is a genuine biological anomaly. His body absorbs punishment that would kill most people 10 times over. He's been shot, electrocuted, fallen from heights that should have been fatal, survived explosions. And each time, He recovers completely, usually by the next episode, sometimes within the same scene. Marge has those same eyes. Her hair defies gravity in a way that has never been explained. Growing straight up in a tower she has maintained in the exact same shape for 36 years, without any evidence of the structural engineering that should be required to keep it there. She too was briefly employed at the nuclear plant, exposed to the same facility, the same leaking systems, the same ambient radiation that has apparently been rewriting the biology of everyone who lives nearby. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were all born after both of their parents had already been living in Springfield for years. Born into a contaminated environment, raised under the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, drinking the same water, breathing the same air, and every one of them displays physical characteristics that, if you encountered them in a real person, would send a doctor reaching for a referral. Here is the detail that makes this theory click into something that's hard to dismiss once you've noticed it. When people visit Springfield from outside, they look different. Celebrities who make guest appearances, characters who travel in from other towns. The proportions are more natural on these people. The eyes are more normally sized. The faces more closely resemble the faces you see when you look at actual human beings. The show draws its outsiders with more realistic features than it draws its residents. And the standard explanation for this is that it's just the art style. Springfield residents look the way they look because that's what The Simpsons looks like. The yellow skin, the overbites, the unusual proportions are stylistic choices made by animators decades ago and maintained ever since. But within the internal logic of the show's own universe, there is an observable, documented difference between the people who live inside Springfield and the people who don't. The people inside the town look one way, the people outside it look another way. And that difference corresponds precisely to what you'd expect if one group had been living in a contaminated environment for decades and the other group had not. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes as his owners, the same proportions that deviate from what you'd expect of a greyhound. Blinky is only the most famous example of Springfield's mutated wildlife. The show has depicted other animals near the plant with unusual characteristics, usually played for laughs, usually forgotten by the next episode. But the fish are important, because the show didn't just show you a three-eyed fish and leave it as a background detail. It gave the fish a name. It made the fish national news within the show's universe. It built an entire political storyline around the question of whether the fish was evidence of environmental contamination. And then, after carefully establishing that the contamination was visible and measurable and literally growing eyes on the local wildlife, it expected you to believe that the same contamination had done absolutely nothing to the humans living in the same environment. Burns knows. That's the part of this theory that makes everything else about his character make a different kind of sense. Burns knows what his plant is doing to Springfield because Burns is personally dependent on understanding what radiation does to biological systems. In the Springfield Files episode, which we'll return to in more detail when we talk about Burns's impossible lifespan, it's revealed that Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so extreme that it causes his body to emit a faint green glow. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. His body cannot sustain itself through normal biological processes anymore. He requires controlled radiation input, the way a normal person requires food. Burns isn't just profiting from radiation, he's powered by it. And that means he understands, at a level none of his employees or neighbors could access, exactly what long-term radiation exposure does to living tissue. He is, in a very real sense, the town's most educated expert on the subject, and he has used that expertise not to protect the people around him but to maintain his monopoly over their power supply, their employment, their economy, and by extension, their ability to do anything about any of it. Homer's continued employment, under this theory, is not an accident. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in a memorable episode, the very first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code, and the estimate nearly bankrupted them. Burns bought the plant back and immediately rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would shut the plant down in a week. Homer ensures the violations continue, not through malice, because Homer is genuinely incapable of malice in any sustained form, but through the kind of cheerful, well-meaning incompetence that is more useful to a man like Burns than any deliberate cover-up could ever be. The radiation keeps leaking, the water stays contaminated, and the people of Springfield stay just impaired enough cognitively and biologically, to not look up at those towers and connect what they see to what they feel. The crayon in Homer's brain is part of this pattern. In season 12, Homer discovers that a crayon has been lodged in his nasal cavity and embedded in his brain since childhood, and that removing it causes his IQ to rise dramatically. He becomes, briefly, a genuinely intelligent person. Articulate, capable of sustained, complex thought, able to see the world around him with clarity he's never had before. And it makes him miserable. Springfield, seen clearly, is a place of almost unbearable sadness and corruption. His job, seen clearly, is an exercise in daily failure with catastrophic potential consequences. His life, seen clearly, is the product of a system designed to keep people like him small and grateful and unquestioning. So Homer has the crayon put back in, he chooses the fog, he chooses not to see, and the show presents this choice with a gentleness that almost disguises how dark it is. Because Homer's choice makes sense, given what he found when he could think clearly, the fog is warmer than the truth. The stupidity is, in a strange way, more comfortable than the intelligence. But here's the question nobody in Springfield asks. How did the crayon get there in the first place? How does a child get a crayon lodged in their brain without anyone noticing? How does Homer go through his entire childhood, his entire adolescence, his entire adult life, visiting doctors in a town with multiple hospitals and medical facilities, and not a single one of them finds a foreign object in his skull? Either every doctor in Springfield is comprehensively incompetent, which would itself require an explanation, or someone in Springfield's medical establishment knew the crayon was there and chose not to remove it. And if the town's doctors are looking the other way, if Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a place he essentially owns, then the crayon isn't just an accident. It's a piece of a larger pattern. It's the show using a very specific, very strange detail to tell you something it can't quite say directly. The people of Springfield have something wrong with their brains, something that makes them docile and incurious and unable to look at the mounting evidence of their own contamination and ask the obvious questions. And whether that something is a crayon or radiation damage or something else entirely, the effect is the same. The town keeps running, the plant keeps leaking, Burns keeps the lights on, and nobody notices the fish. The radiation theory doesn't answer one mystery about the Simpsons. It answers all of them from a single point of origin. The aging stasis becomes a mutation effect. The town's biological clock altered at the cellular level by decades of radioactive exposure. The resilience Homer shows after catastrophic injuries becomes an adaptation, his body rebuilding itself after damage the way a system under sustained stress eventually finds a new equilibrium. The cognitive impairment that runs through the town becomes a feature rather than a bug, the same contamination that mutated their bodies having worked its way into the neurological systems responsible for critical thinking. And the plant, the cracked and humming and quietly catastrophic plant that sits on the edge of Springfield and has been there longer than most of its residents can clearly remember, is not a background detail. It is the engine of everything. Every yellow face, every unusual recovery, every forgotten disaster, every unexplained mystery. It all starts there, in the same broken facility, with the same invisible poison moving through the same water supply, touching everything and leaving its mark on all of it. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town. Under this theory, it's a contamination zone that has been successfully marketed as a quirky cartoon town. The difference between those two things is enormous. And the fact that the show has been telling you which one it is, quietly and consistently, for 36 years without anyone stopping the episode to address it directly, is perhaps the strangest and most interesting thing about it. But there are other explanations, and some of them are even stranger than this one. We'll get to those. Tonight, we have time for all of it. Drop a comment right now with where in the world you are and what time it is where you're watching from. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing people from completely different places, under completely different skies, are all settling into the same 4 hours together. And if you want to be here for the next one, subscribing is how you make sure you don't miss it. Number. Section 2. The Burns Conspiracy, One Man's Grudge, 3 Generations. There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never considered. A version where almost every bad thing that has ever happened to Homer Simpson traces back to a single source. Where the brokenness of this particular family, across at least 3 generations, is not the result of bad luck or poor choices or the kind of cosmic indifference that makes ordinary life hard for ordinary people. A version where Homer's suffering was engineered, where the man who signs his paychecks is also the man who destroyed his childhood, where the incompetence and the emotional damage and the cognitive impairment all converge on a single billionaire who needed a specific kind of broken employee in a specific seat in a specific sector of his nuclear facility, and went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that was exactly what he got. This is the Burns conspiracy, and it starts not with Homer, but with his mother. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him she had passed away when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned. In whatever way a person mourns the abstract loss of something they never quite had, and he grew up believing he was a boy whose mother had died and whose father was too emotionally closed off to fill the space she left. That belief, that foundational wound, shaped Homer's personality more completely than anything else in his life. His desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his willingness to endure indignity after indignity from an employer who can't even remember his name, rather than risk losing the one stable thing he has. His compulsive clinging to Marge, to his children, to the warmth of domestic life, as though he's always on some level afraid it might be taken from him. Homer Simpson's entire emotional architecture is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. The joviality, the recklessness, the way he throws himself into experiences with a kind of desperate enthusiasm, these are the behaviors of someone who learned very young that the things you love can disappear without warning. So you grab what you can, you enjoy what you have, and you try not to think too hard about the fact that everything feels slightly temporary. And then season 7 revealed that the loss was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson, and it aired in November of 1995, and it is, by most measures, one of the finest episodes the show has ever produced. The setup is, characteristically, absurd. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, pushes a dummy off a cliff near the power plant, and then has to go to the Hall of Records to correct the administrative error of his apparent demise. While there, he discovers something that reorients his entire understanding of his life. His mother is alive. She has been alive this whole time. The grave Abe showed him belonged to someone else entirely, a poet named Walt Whitman. Abe had been pointing at a famous writer's headstone and telling his son it was his mother's burial site for decades. Homer finds Mona in a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, mourning the death of a child who is standing 20 feet away from her. When they recognize each other, the scene the show gives us is quiet and genuinely moving. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a grave that belongs to neither of them. It's exactly the kind of moment The Simpsons does better than almost any other show on television, wrapping genuine emotional devastation in a premise so absurd that you almost don't see the gut punch coming until it's already landed. And then Mona tells Homer the truth. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she had to. Because staying would have put Homer and Abe in danger. Because the man who now employs Homer, the man Homer has worked for his entire adult life, had made her a fugitive. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was, by her own account, an ordinary woman, a housewife. Married to Abe, living in Springfield, raising a young son. Ordinary in the way that a lot of people are ordinary until something happens that shows them a version of themselves they didn't know existed. What happened to Mona was the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, the sense, shared by a lot of people in that particular moment, that ordinary life was not a sufficient response to what was happening in the world. The show depicts her radicalization with its usual combination of comedy and unexpected sincerity. She joined a group of activists, and together they targeted a biological weapons laboratory, owned by Mr. Burns. Take a moment with that detail. Burns didn't just own the nuclear power plant. He owned a facility designed to produce weaponized biological agents. He was manufacturing pathogens in Springfield, in a town where children were growing up, where families were living their lives, where the air and water were already being quietly contaminated by his nuclear facility. Burns was also running a germ warfare operation. The show establishes this as canonical fact, drops it into the backstory of a character who has been dead for 6 seasons, and then allows the audience to absorb it. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological material stored inside. The mission was, by any measure, a success. The weapons were neutralized. The lab was compromised. The pathogens that Burns had been developing in a residential area were gone. But on the way out, Mona made one mistake. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos of the raid, and Mona stopped to help. And the person she stopped to help was Burns. She looked at a man on the ground, and her instinct was to assist him. And in doing so, she looked up and met his eyes. And he saw her face, and he remembered it. Burns reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her family. She couldn't pick up the phone and call Abe, couldn't write a letter, couldn't find any way to explain to her son why she had to disappear. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping, and she left. And Homer woke up to a world where his mother was gone, and his father told him she was dead, and that was the story Homer carried with him for the next 27 years. Now consider what Burns did next. Not immediately after the raid, but over the following decades, he held a grudge. A personal, sustained, actively maintained grudge against a woman who had destroyed his weapons program and made him look vulnerable. When Mona comes back to Springfield in Season 7, when Homer has just found his mother and the family is experiencing something that might, in a different kind of show, be the beginning of healing, Burns spots her through a cab window. He recognizes her immediately. He calls the authorities. The FBI returns. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. And this time he knows why. He knows who forced her out originally and who is forcing her out again. He knows the name of the man responsible. He knows it's his employer. And he doesn't connect the dots. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't even, as far as the show depicts, fully process the fact that the billionaire who signs his paychecks is the same person who stole his mother when he was 6 years old. Homer walks back to work. The show moves on. And Burns continues to employ a man whose emotional devastation is, at least in part, Burns' doing. This is where the theory sharpens into something genuinely dark, because Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. The man Homer has become, the emotionally needy, approval-seeking, cognitively impaired, relentlessly loyal employee who will absorb any amount of mistreatment rather than risk losing the stability of a steady paycheck, that man is, in a meaningful sense, the product of what Burns did in 1969. By driving Mona away when Homer was a young child, Burns created a boy who would grow up hungry for love and approval. A boy who would learn that the things you depend on can vanish without explanation. A boy who would become an adult terrified of confrontation, desperate for belonging, grateful to whoever offered him any semblance of security. The perfect employee for a man who needed someone in a dangerous job to stay quiet and compliant and not ask too many questions about why the cooling towers keep making that sound. Homer doesn't work at the power plant because he's too unintelligent to find something better. Homer works there because Burns broke him as a child, and the broken version of Homer is exactly what Burns needs in Sector 7G. The show confirms this dynamic further through the revelation about Abe. It comes out, in a later season, that Burns committed some unspecified crime, and Abe discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant. Permanent employment, unconditional, regardless of performance. Homer could make 742 documented errors, which he has, and the job would still be there. The deal protected him. So Homer's job security, which has always seemed like one of the show's great convenient absurdities, a man who causes nuclear incidents and retains his position, has a completely logical explanation within the show's own internal mechanics. Homer was never going to be fired. Not because Burns is careless or forgetful, but because Burns signed a contract with Homer's father in exchange for Abe's silence about something that could have brought Burns down. Homer is not just an employee. He's a debt. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken in sequence. Abe, who knew the truth and buried it and made a deal with the man responsible. Mona, who fought back and paid for it with 27 years in hiding. Homer, who inherited the wreckage of both choices and never understood why his life felt the way it did. Why the good things kept slipping away. Why he was always one moment away from losing everything, even when nothing seemed immediately threatening. The anxiety without a name that Homer has never been able to articulate because his brain wasn't equipped to trace it back to its source. Burns didn't just take Homer's mother, he took Homer's potential. The episode where Homer has the crayon removed proves this. Without the crayon, without whatever damage the radiation has done on top of it, Homer is brilliant. Not just functional, not just coping, genuinely brilliant, articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding and engaging with the world at a level that his Springfield existence has never once required of him. That Homer exists inside the Homer we see every episode, trapped behind the crayon and the decades of contamination and the emotional wounds that were opened when he was 6 years old, and his mother kissed him while he was sleeping and disappeared. Homer chose to put the crayon back because being smart in Springfield was unbearable, and that choice is heartbreaking because it was never really a free choice. The town itself and the man who runs it had already predetermined the options. Homer could be brilliant and miserable, or foggy and capable of something that felt enough like happiness to get through the day. Burns made sure those were the only two options on the table. Burns made sure there was no third door that led out of Springfield entirely, towards some life Homer might have built with the intelligence that was always in there, waiting. Mona died in a later season. The show gives her exit exactly the dignity it deserves. Homer is with her. He holds her hand. He watches her go. There's no joke softening the moment, no cutaway gag to relieve the weight of it. Just a man losing his mother for real this time, after decades of losing her in theory. The grief is clean and specific and completely earned. And Burns, somewhere on the other side of town in his mansion, continues exactly as he always has, running his facility, managing his investments, undergoing his weekly treatments, living the indefinite, medically maintained, morally uncomplicated life of a man who has never once faced a genuine consequence for anything he has done to anybody. The conspiracy is not hidden. The show laid it out piece by piece, across decades of episodes. It just laid it out the way that real conspiracies work, not in a single dramatic revelation, but in gradual accumulation. A detail here, a flashback there, a throwaway line that doesn't seem important until you connect it to 3 other throwaway lines, and something clicks into place that you can't unclick. Burns destroyed a family. Burns profited from the destruction. Burns collected the broken pieces and put them to work in his facility, and collected a check from every one of them. And the beautiful, horrible irony at the center of all of it is that Homer, the man Burns broke most completely, loves the job. Loves the donuts in the break room and the familiar hum of the reactor and the steady paycheck and the sense that this is his place in the world, his contribution, his reason for getting up every morning. Homer loves working at the plant that is quietly poisoning him. Homer is grateful to the man who stole his mother. The system worked exactly as designed. Number. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The case that was never closed. The summer of 1995 was, for a very specific subset of the American television audience, dominated by a single question. A fictional question about a fictional crime in a fictional town. But the question was asked with such theatrical earnestness, by a show so deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness, that it briefly became something that people genuinely argued about. At parties, at work, on early internet forums that look almost impossibly quaint by today's standards. Who shot Mr. Burns? Before we dig into the evidence, it's worth dwelling on how strange it was that this mystery existed at all. The Simpsons, in the summer of 1995, was the most popular animated show in the history of American television. It had already become a cultural institution, and it had never done anything like this. It had never set up a genuine mystery, a real whodunit with a summer-long cliffhanger, designed to be solved by the audience from clues embedded in the episode. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the fictional shooting like a real unsolved case. There was a contest, a national contest where viewers could submit their guess for the shooter, and the winner, the person who correctly identified the culprit from the available evidence, would be animated into a future episode of the show. Thousands of entries came in, and according to the DVD commentary, none of the randomly selected entries from the pool correctly identified Maggie Simpson as the shooter. Not one. The prize was awarded randomly to someone who didn't have the right answer, and they received a cash payment instead of the animated cameo, because animating the wrong guess would have been too confusing. The show's writers, on that same commentary, acknowledged that someone online, posting to a Simpsons newsgroup on the night the first episode aired, had correctly identified Maggie, one person. Using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the producers tried to track them down, They issued an open invitation for this person to come forward and, as far as anyone knows, never heard from them. One person out of thousands, from a college account that vanished, and even that person was working from an internet forum post rather than submitting an official entry. What does that tell you? Either the mystery was genuinely unsolvable from the available clues, or the answer didn't follow logically from what the show presented, or both. The contest was built on the premise that a careful viewer could identify the shooter from part 1, and the contest produced effectively 0 correct answers from the actual contestant pool. But the official answer is Maggie. So let's look at the evidence for it, and then let's look at everything that doesn't quite fit. The setup. Season 6, Episode 25. Mr. Burns had, by the end of part 1, managed to antagonize essentially every person in Springfield. He stole an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's funding. He closed Moe's Tavern by bankrupting its owner. He destroyed the Springfield retirement home through the sinkhole his drilling operation created. He injured the Simpson family dog. And then, as a finale to all of this, he built a giant mechanical device to block the sun over Springfield, forcing every resident to purchase their electricity from his plant or live in permanent darkness. When Smithers protested, Burns fired him on the spot. By the end of part 1, you have a town full of people who have been systematically harmed by a single man, gathered in a public meeting with that man present, many of them visibly armed, united by the kind of collective fury that usually ends in something irreversible. Burns walks out of the meeting. He's shot. He staggers to the town sundial, falls, and his hands land on 2 letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective, M and S. Season 7, Part 2. The Investigation. Springfield's police department, led by Chief Wiggum, manages the case with the competence the show has always assigned them. Smithers confesses immediately, and is immediately eliminated because he was blackout drunk during the shooting and actually shot someone entirely different. Old Jasper and his wooden leg, blocks away from the actual crime scene. One by one, other suspects are cleared through alibis, or in Tito Puente's case, through an elaborate musical number. The investigation stalls until an eyelash is found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis identifies it as belonging to a Simpson. Homer has a fingerprint on the gun. Homer had the most clearly documented motive in the room, Burns having never once learned his name despite Homer working for him for years. Homer is arrested and is about to be convicted. Burns wakes up. He identifies his shooter, Maggie Simpson. Burns claims he encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the meeting. He tried to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Except, let's go through the specific problems with this account, one at a time. The sundial. Burns's hands landed on W and S, or from his perspective M and S. The show uses this as its central clue, the one that was supposed to tell careful viewers who they were looking for. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself, in the actual episode, states clearly that the way his hands fell on the sundial was not intentional. He didn't deliberately position himself to indicate his attacker. He was shot, he staggered, he fell. The placement of his hands was incidental. The central clue in the mystery, the clue that was presumably the most visible hint planted for the audience, is explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. The gun. Burns was carrying a weapon in a holster. In the episode, that holster is shown empty before the shooting. Burns's gun was already missing from his person before he was attacked. Whoever shot Burns used his own gun, which they must have obtained before the attack, or which Burns dropped and someone picked up. The official account says Burns's gun fell from his holster during a struggle with Maggie over a lollipop, and that's possible. But it also means the shooter was someone who didn't bring a weapon to the meeting, someone who encountered Burns's gun by chance rather than arriving prepared. This actually fits Maggie. It also fits quite a few other people who weren't carrying weapons that night. Burns's last words. Before he was shot, someone approached him in the parking lot and Burns said, quite distinctly, "Oh, it's you." Not a statement of surprise. Not a cry of alarm. A calm recognition. The phrasing of someone who sees a familiar face and acknowledges them without particular concern. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has there ever been an established relationship between them? Burns can't reliably remember Homer's name. Homer works for him. The idea that Burns would see an infant in a parking lot and react with the specific warmth of, "Oh, it's you," as though greeting a known quantity, doesn't fit what the show has established about how Burns processes the people around him. Season 18. Homer, in an offhand comment during an unrelated episode, claims to have been the one who actually shot Burns. He says it clearly, on camera, and nothing happens. No investigation, no reopened case, no consequences at all. The show treats it as a throwaway moment and moves on. If Homer is telling the truth in Season 18, then the official verdict was wrong. Maggie was blamed for a crime her father committed. If Homer is lying, if he's claiming credit for something he didn't do, then why does the show play the moment so casually? Why no correction? Why no other character noting that Homer just confessed to attempted murder? The alternate ending. A complete, fully animated, fully voiced alternate version of Part 2 exists in which Smithers is revealed as the real shooter. This was not a rough draft or a discarded outline. It was a completed production, shown in the context of The Simpsons' 138th episode Spectacular, a clip show hosted by Troy McClure. McClure dismisses the Smithers ending by explaining that to use it, all the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be, quote, downright nutty. This line is a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, which was ongoing at the time, in which a jury famously disregarded DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show is making a joke about the fact that evidence gets ignored when powerful forces want it ignored. And it's making that joke in the context of explaining why the Smithers ending couldn't be used. The show is winking at you. It's saying, the official answer is the one they went with, but ignoring evidence to reach a preferred verdict is something that happens, and we all know it. An early draft had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers actively considered this, developed it enough to include it in the scripting process, and then discarded it. The point being that the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually settled on. The mystery was constructed backward, which means the clues were never as definitive as the promotional materials suggested. Now, the alternate theory that has the most compelling internal logic, the Marge theory. Marge Simpson had motive that was at least as strong as anyone else in Springfield. She watched Burns destroy her children's school. She watched Burns injure her dog. She watched Burns take the sun away from the town where her family lived. And Marge is, underneath the patient exterior, a woman with a core of steel. The show has demonstrated this repeatedly. Marge does not break easily, but when she does break, what emerges is not hysteria. It's focused, purposeful action. The theory builds on a detail from an earlier episode. Marge gets a job in which Burns becomes infatuated with Marge. Burns develops a specific, remembered attachment to her, of the kind he has for essentially no one else in Springfield, which would explain, under this theory, why he didn't identify her as his attacker after the shooting. Burns woke up, saw who had shot him, and chose not to say her name. He protected her. He pointed at the sundial and let the investigation follow its own logic toward whatever conclusion it reached. And the conclusion it reached was Maggie. Chief Wiggum noted, at the moment of Maggie's identification, that no jury in the world would convict a baby. Maggie was the perfect conclusion to an investigation that needed to close without resulting in consequences. A 1-year-old cannot be prosecuted. A 1-year-old cannot be imprisoned. The case closes, the town moves on, the real shooter, if Marge is the real shooter, goes home and makes dinner, and nobody ever looks twice. And then there's the final shot of Part 2. After Burns has made his statement, after Homer has been cleared, after the case has officially been resolved, the camera finds Maggie. She's alone in the room. She looks around carefully, confirming nobody is watching. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that replicates pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as confirmation. Maggie knows what she did, and she's replaying it privately, and the secret smile in her eyes is the secret smile of someone who got away with something. But there's another reading. Maggie is an infant. She witnessed an act of violence in a parking lot, either one she committed or one she saw committed by someone else. And she is doing what infants do. She is mimicking what she saw, not confessing, remembering. The distinction between those two things depends entirely on whether Maggie actually pulled the trigger, and the evidence for that conclusion is shakier than the show's confidence in it suggests. The greatest mystery in the history of The Simpsons was never really solved. It was closed. The case was administratively resolved and filed away, and the town moved on because Springfield always moves on. Because the alternative to moving on is staying with the uncomfortable thing and asking the uncomfortable questions, And that is not what Springfield does. The contest nobody won, the clues that the victim himself described as coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully produced, the season 18 confession that nobody investigated, the final shot that can be read in two completely opposite ways. All of it points to the same conclusion. The official answer might be right, but the official answer is the one that was most convenient. And in a town that has, as we'll examine later, actually passed a law making inconvenient truths illegal. Convenience and truth have never been the same thing. Number. Section 4. Homer's Coma, the theory that reframes everything. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 of The Simpsons aired on Fox. It was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, April Fool's Day. The episode involved Bart playing increasingly elaborate pranks on Homer, culminating in taking one of Homer's beers to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion puts him in the hospital. While Homer is in the hospital bed recovering, he sees a vending machine across the room. He tries to get a candy bar. The machine tips over and crushes him. Homer Simpson goes into a coma. A real coma. Not a dream sequence, not a fantasy, not a cutaway. The show depicts him flatlining. It depicts his unconscious state with unusual specificity. And then, apparently, he wakes up. Bart tearfully confesses at his bedside. Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Normal service is resumed. The show tells you he woke up. In the final moments of the same episode, it also tells you that Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. Permanently. Gone, the doctor says, and never coming back. And Homer's response to learning about this permanent neurological damage is to laugh, while noting that he doesn't understand why he's laughing. The family finds this charming. The episode ends. The Simpsons continues for 32 more years. Unless it doesn't. Unless Homer never actually woke up at all. This is the coma theory. Originally proposed on Reddit under a username that has since become minor internet legend, the core premise is disarmingly simple. Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma in April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date is a dream generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function while his family sits beside him and waits. The evidence accumulates in layers, and each layer is more unsettling than the last. Start with the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic exactly. It was always a cartoon with cartoon logic, but the storylines dealt with recognizable human problems at a human scale. Homer tries to quit drinking and fails. Marge seriously considers having an affair and pulls back at the last moment. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher and experiences the particular embarrassment of early adolescence. Bart struggles academically and faces the possibility of being held back a grade. These are the problems real families have. Financial stress, marital friction, academic failure, the steady, low-grade anxiety of trying to raise children in circumstances that don't quite match what you hoped for. The emotional core of the early Simpsons was built on the recognizable. The satire had teeth because the situations weren't exotic. They were the situations most of the audience was already living in. After the coma, everything escalates. Homer goes to space. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer joins a secret society that turns out to be the Springfield branch of the Stonecutters. Homer discovers his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades. Homer meets God, twice. He meets presidents, travels to dozens of countries, holds somewhere in the range of 200 different jobs over the course of the series, befriends celebrities from virtually every field of human endeavor, and survives physical trauma that would be fatal to any living organism. The escalation is so dramatic that it has been the subject of ongoing fan debate for over 2 decades. People argue constantly about when The Simpsons stopped being good, what caused the decline, whether it was a sudden change or a gradual drift. There are entire taxonomies of the shift, named after specific episodes that are cited as turning points. The coma theory argues that there is no gradual drift. There is a precise moment, the 1st of April 1993. The Simpsons didn't get worse after that date. Homer's brain got worse. And the show's increasingly surreal, increasingly disconnected from reality storytelling is not a symptom of creative exhaustion. It's a symptom of neurological deterioration. A brain in a long-term coma, cut off from normal sensory input, deprived of the structure that waking life provides, doesn't just go quiet. It keeps running. It processes what it has. It generates scenarios from memory and imagination and fragments of external stimuli, and it stitches them together into something that has the shape of experience without quite following the rules of experience. The dreams become more elaborate over time, not more coherent. Reality gets softer. The narrative rules that kept early episodes grounded keep getting bent, and the bending becomes more extreme the longer the coma continues, which matches the arc of the show almost perfectly. Now the detail that makes the theory haunt you long after you've heard it. 6 months before the coma episode, in the season 4 premiere, Homer has a conversation with God. A face-to-face conversation. And during that conversation, which the show plays with comic reverence, God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. Homer's time, God says, is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. If you read that conversation through the lens of the coma theory, the tone of it changes completely. God was not making a casual theological observation. God was telling Homer, with the gentle specificity of someone who actually knows what's about to happen, that his waking life was approaching its end. His time is coming. 6 months later, his time came. The aging problem. This is the single most powerful piece of evidence for the coma theory, and it's the one that every other explanation handles less elegantly. Nobody in Springfield ages. The floating timeline explanation says that's just how animated shows work. The radiation theory says the contamination has altered the biology of aging. But the coma theory has the answer that requires the least additional theorizing. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen mind of a man who went to sleep in April 1993. Of course, the children don't grow up. Homer's unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he wasn't there to see it. His reference for Bart is a 10-year-old boy. That's the Bart he has. His reference for Lisa is an 8-year-old. His reference for Maggie is an infant. He can't dream them older because he doesn't have the information. He has to work with what he had when the vending machine fell, and what he had at that moment is frozen into the dream. Marge doesn't age because the last time Homer saw her, she looked exactly the way she looks in every episode. Barney doesn't age, Ned doesn't age. Nobody in Springfield has aged a single day because nobody in Springfield exists outside the mind of a man who has been unconscious since 1993, and the mind can only dream what it knows. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons have an explanation under this theory too. Homer is lying in a hospital. The television in the room is on sometimes. Visitors come and go and leave the radio playing. Nurses have conversations in the hallway. Homer's brain, processing fragments of external sound and media, incorporates them. A voice it recognizes becomes a character in the dream. A name it hears becomes a face. The celebrity guest appearances that became a defining feature of the show's later seasons are not Springfield becoming a magnet for famous people. They're Homer's dreaming brain absorbing whatever reaches it through the fog and weaving those fragments into the simulation. The show acknowledged the theory directly in season 34. An episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked deleted scene, an apparently unauthorized clip in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and the whole preceding run of the show is revealed to have been a dream. The scene was animated. It was shown to the audience, and then it was explained as a hoax, a fake scene planted by hackers, not real, ignore it. But the scene exists. Someone made it. Someone voiced it and animated it and included it in a broadcast context. The writers engaged with the theory seriously enough to produce a fully realized version of its conclusion, and their dismissal of it came wrapped inside an episode that depicted exactly what the theory describes: Homer waking up from a coma. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show for most of its run, addressed the theory in 2015. He said it isn't true. He didn't explain the tonal shift after season 4. He didn't explain why the show becomes increasingly surreal as the seasons progress, in precisely the pattern you'd expect from a deteriorating brain. He didn't address the God conversation from the season 4 premiere. He just said it isn't true, and the conversation moved on. And here is what the theory actually is. Underneath all the evidence and the timeline analysis and the specific callbacks to individual episodes, it's a love story. The saddest and most beautiful reading of what The Simpsons is, at its core. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his unconscious mind builds an entire universe to preserve, is not complicated. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, impossible, infuriating little boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in her room, badly at first and then beautifully. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to hold in one arm while he watches the game. He wants Friday nights on Evergreen Terrace to last forever. In the coma, they do. The dream gives him everything he's afraid of losing, preserved exactly as it was at the moment of loss. His children don't age because he needs them not to age. The world resets after every catastrophe because catastrophes can't be allowed to stick. Homer survives everything because nothing can actually hurt him. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and the mind cannot kill the dreamer because the dreamer is the one telling the story. And every episode since April 1993, under this reading, is not a story about a cartoon family in a fictional town. It's a love letter written by an unconscious father to the people he loves most. An act of devotion from a dying man's brain, building and rebuilding the only thing he ever wanted, over and over, night after night, episode after episode, because the alternative to the dream is a hospital room and the sound of machines and the question of how much time has passed and whether anyone is still sitting beside the bed. Homer Simpson has been dreaming for over 30 years, and in the dream, he always finds his way home by the end of the episode. Because in the dream, he never left. Section 5. The immortality of Mr. Burns too expensive to die. Charles Montgomery Burns should not be alive. This is not a metaphorical statement about whether his moral choices entitle him to continued existence. It's a straightforward biological observation. Within the established continuity of The Simpsons, Burns was born somewhere in the late 19th century. The show has placed his birth in different years across different episodes. The way the show places everything in different years across different episodes, but even the most generous reading of the available evidence suggests he is well over 100 years old. By the more specific historical references the show has given him, he may be closer to 140. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, in a role the show carefully avoids describing too heroically. He has referenced the Gilded Age not as something he read about, but as something he remembers experiencing. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the Second World War and hid it for decades. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. His personal memories of American history span from before the turn of the 20th century to the present. And he doesn't just exist at the margins. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manages complex financial strategies. He manipulates municipal politics with a sophistication that suggests clear cognitive engagement with the modern world. He is, by any measure of strategic intelligence, one of the sharpest minds in Springfield. Not in the diminished, vestigial way of someone whose faculties are present but fading. Burns is still sharp, still calculating, still several moves ahead of everyone around him. He's been running the same operation for longer than most of the country has been electrified, and he shows no signs of strategic decline. How is this possible? The show answers this question in the Springfield Files episode, but answers it so casually, so quickly, that the full weight of the answer is easy to miss if you're watching at normal speed and expecting it to matter. In that episode, Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield that he believes is an alien. A glowing figure moving through the trees with an unearthly quality that suggests nothing of this world. The town panics. FBI investigators arrive. The episode builds to a climactic reveal, and when the truth comes out, the glowing figure in the woods is Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment. The nature of the treatment is not fully specified, but it involves enough chemical and radiological intervention that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow in the hours immediately after each session. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without it, he dies. There is no tapering. There is no tolerance. He needs the treatment, on schedule, every week, or the biological systems keeping him functional begin to fail, and within days he is gone. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing. Miss one appointment and everything stops. The treatment involves radiation. This is significant in the context of everything else we've discussed about the power plant and its effects on Springfield. The man who owns the nuclear facility that has been quietly irradiating his town for decades is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own life. Burns isn't just using the plant to generate electricity, he's using it to keep himself alive. The radiation that damages his employees and his neighbors, is the same substance that, in a carefully managed form, is the only thing standing between Burns and the end. He's not outside the contamination zone. He's the most contaminated person in it. He has simply had the resources to turn contamination into a medical protocol and the expertise to manage that protocol on a weekly basis. And then there's the immune system. The show gives Burns one of the most memorably absurd medical situations in its history, in an episode where his doctor informs him that Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously, existing in his body at the same time. You might expect a doctor delivering this information to follow it with a prognosis of imminent death. Instead, the doctor explains that the diseases have reached a state of perfect equilibrium. Each one cancels out the others. They're all present simultaneously, all trying to kill their host simultaneously, and because they're all pushing in different directions at once, none of them can make progress. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome. The image is of three diseases trying to fit through a doorway at the same time. They all want to kill Burns. None of them can because they're all competing for the same doorway, jamming each other, blocking each other's progress. Burns is the sickest man in the United States. Burns is also functionally indestructible because everything that should kill him is being neutralized by everything else that should kill him. Played for laughs. One of the most quoted scenes in the show. But under the radiation theory, this disease equilibrium is not a cosmic joke. It's the result of the weekly treatments. The radiation regimen Burns undergoes isn't curing his diseases. It's maintaining the equilibrium between them. It's adjusting the balance so that no single illness gains enough ground to break through the gridlock. Burns's body is a reactor, and his weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods. Too much intervention in one direction and the balance tips, something gains dominance, and Burns dies. Too little and the equilibrium slowly collapses on its own. The treatments keep the conditions exactly right for the stalemate to persist indefinitely. Smithers' role in all of this is more than loyalty. The show has established across dozens of episodes that Burns is helpless without Smithers. Physically, functionally helpless. Not emotionally dependent, though that dimension exists too. Physically dependent. Smithers manages Burns' schedule. He ensures Burns makes every weekly appointment. He monitors Burns' physical condition with a vigilance that has always been played as obsessive devotion but functions, under this reading, as medical necessity. Smithers is the person responsible for keeping the protocol intact. Miss a session, miss an appointment, let the schedule slip by even a few days, and the equilibrium begins to fail. Smithers is not just a personal assistant. He's the logistics infrastructure that keeps Burns alive. The show has established this in moments that usually get read as comedy. When Smithers is removed from his position for any reason, Burns deteriorates with alarming speed. Not emotionally, though he does become more erratic, but physically. His already precarious body begins to fail faster when the schedule isn't maintained. And when Smithers returns, the recovery is prompt. Smithers knows this. The show implies that Smithers has known this for a long time. His devotion to Burns is not simply the devotion of an employee to an employer, or even the devotion of someone with a complicated personal attachment to the person he serves. It's the devotion of a man who understands that his absence is a death sentence. Smithers stays because leaving means Burns dies. And Smithers cannot let Burns die because Burns, for all his monstrous qualities, is the only person in Smithers' life who genuinely and utterly depends on him. There is a dark symbiosis here. Burns gives Smithers purpose and belonging, things Smithers has found nowhere else. Smithers gives Burns the logistical maintenance that keeps him breathing. Neither can let the other go. The relationship is a closed loop. Burns' historical connections add another layer to the immortality question. He has not merely been alive for over a century. He has been active, engaged, and accumulating power and resources for that entire time. The Burns family fortune predates most of the institutions that regulate American economic life. His connections run through historical moments that shaped the country. He was in rooms where decisions were made. He knew people who shaped the 20th century. And he has outlasted all of them. Not by being lucky, but by building a system that could not afford to let him die. Every dollar Burns has ever earned, every politician he's purchased, every doctor he's retained, every institution he's compromised, all of it serves one ultimate function: keep Burns alive. Keep the treatments running. Keep Smithers employed and engaged and committed. Keep the plant operating to fund the medical infrastructure. Because if Burns dies, the empire dies. And empires, as a general principle, do not allow themselves to die. The most disturbing element of Burns's immortality is not that he might live forever, it's that Springfield needs him to. The town's economy runs on the power plant. The power plant runs on Burns. Burns runs on the treatments. The treatments run on the wealth the plant generates. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system in which the town and the billionaire are economically codependent in a way that makes true accountability essentially impossible. Springfield could not survive the loss of the plant. The plant cannot function without Burns. Burns cannot be held accountable without the plant shutting down, which would destroy the town. Burns is not immortal. He's something more specific and more troubling than immortal. He is too expensive to die. The town has been paying the cost of his survival for decades, in the form of contaminated water and irradiated children, and a safety inspector who sleeps at his desk, and an economy so dependent on one man's continued operation that any serious challenge to his authority would be economically catastrophic for everyone. Springfield keeps Burns alive not because it loves him, not because it is deceived about his nature, but because the infrastructure of the town and the infrastructure of Burns's survival have been so completely intertwined that one cannot fall without the other following. He's not a villain who won. He's a system that became too large and too interconnected to dismantle. And systems like that don't end through confrontation. They end through collapse. Or they don't end at all. Burns was alive before the power plant. He will likely still be alive long after everyone currently living in Springfield is gone. Not because he has transcended mortality, but because he has made mortality too expensive for the people around him to allow. Number. Section 6. Maggie's Secret. The smartest person in Springfield. Maggie Simpson has said, in 36 years of continuous broadcast, exactly one word. The word was, Daddy. It was voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in what amounted to a celebrity cameo, in a moment so unusual that the show seems to have treated it as a one-time event never to be repeated. Since then, Maggie has communicated exclusively through pacifier sounds, expressive stares, and the occasional gesture that somehow manages to convey more information than most of the conversations her family members have with each other. She is, officially, 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since the show began. In that time, she has shot a billionaire, led a daycare uprising against a tyrannical caretaker, saved her family from multiple situations that would have been lethal to any reasonable infant. And she has done all of this while maintaining a persona of complete helplessness, the kind of blank, passive, mildly confused expression that adults project onto babies because that's what babies are supposed to be like. The theory about Maggie is not that she accidentally did remarkable things. The theory is that everything Maggie has done has been deliberate, calculated, the product of an intelligence operating at a level that nobody in Springfield suspects, and Maggie herself has taken careful measures to conceal. Start with the shooting. The conventional reading of the Burns shooting is that Maggie found a gun and it went off, a tragic accident involving an infant who didn't understand what she was holding. But look at the final shot of the episode again. After Burns has identified his attacker, after the case has been officially resolved, after everyone else has left the room, Maggie is alone. She checks the room carefully, confirms she's not being observed, and then mimes firing a gun with her pacifier. There are two ways to read this scene. Either Maggie is performing a guilty gesture, privately acknowledging what she did, or she is mimicking something she witnessed, which is what babies do when they see something that made an impression. The choice between these readings depends entirely on what you believe Maggie is capable of. If Maggie is as intelligent as the evidence suggests, the first reading implies something striking. She waited until she was alone. She verified her solitude before performing the gesture. She understood that demonstrating awareness of what happened would have consequences, and she chose the moment of maximum privacy to revisit the memory. Those are not the behaviors of a 1-year-old operating on instinct and reflex. Those are the behaviors of someone who thinks several steps ahead. The Longest Daycare. In 2012, a theatrical short film was released in cinemas before an Ice Age sequel. 7 minutes. Nominated for an Academy Award. And it is 7 minutes of Maggie Simpson demonstrating cognitive abilities that would be remarkable in an adult, operating in a body that can barely maintain upright balance. The premise is simple. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare facility run with authoritarian efficiency. Inside, she encounters a caterpillar about to transform into a butterfly. Another baby, a recurring antagonist in the show's universe, wants to kill it. What follows is a sequence in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the staff, and the facility's security infrastructure to protect the caterpillar and guide it to freedom. Without speaking, without walking reliably, with the motor capabilities of a 12-month-old child, she reads the environment systematically, identifying threats and resources. She develops strategies that require multiple steps and adjusts them when conditions change. She executes plans that demand timing, spatial reasoning, and the ability to predict other people's behavior accurately enough to work around them. She improvises under pressure. When a plan fails, she pivots immediately without panic, rebuilding from what's available. Every decision she makes is correct. Every move is optimal. In a 7-minute short film with no dialogue from the protagonist, Maggie demonstrates more sophisticated problem-solving than most Springfield adults display across full half-hour episodes. Her physical limitations are real. She falls. She crawls when she should be running. Her body cannot keep up with her mind. But her intelligence compensates. She works within her physical constraints without being diminished by them, engineering solutions that exploit the environment rather than requiring physical capability she doesn't yet have. This is consistent across the show's history. The times the show has directly tested Maggie's intelligence have produced results so high the tests couldn't properly measure them. These moments are played quickly, usually for a laugh, but the pattern they form over the course of the series is consistent. Maggie is not a normal baby. Now consider her silence against the backdrop of what she watches every day in the Simpson household. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Genuinely, measurably brilliant, with an IQ that dwarfs everyone in the household and most of the adults in Springfield. She is kind, curious, principled, and engaged with the world in a way that should be celebrated and rewarded. And what has Lisa's intelligence gotten her? Isolation. She is consistently mocked by her peers, dismissed by adults, ignored by the town, and tolerated rather than appreciated within her own family. Her insights get brushed aside. Her causes get abandoned. Her attempts to improve the world around her get crushed by a community that has no real interest in being improved. Lisa announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and the room's consistent response is to find this annoying. Maggie has watched this happen from the time she could watch anything. She has been observing the consequences of visible intelligence in this particular household and this particular town since before she could sit up reliably. And what she has observed is that intelligence, deployed openly, loudly, in the way Lisa deploys it, is punished in Springfield. It earns you nothing but resistance and resentment. So Maggie does not deploy her intelligence openly. She does not announce herself. She does not perform capability in ways that would invite scrutiny. She maintains the perfect disguise. She acts exactly the way everyone expects a baby to act. Quiet, passive, dependent, occasionally responsive to stimuli in the mildly interesting way that infants are occasionally mildly interesting. And behind that disguise, she watches, she processes, she accumulates information and understanding and situational awareness at a rate that nobody around her suspects, because nobody around her is looking. Every time Maggie acts, she acts in the spaces nobody monitors. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody pays close attention to how infants organize. The shooting became the most discussed mystery in Springfield's history, but the central suspect was a baby, and nobody interrogated a baby. Every heroic intervention Maggie has made, every life she has saved, every problem she has solved, has happened in the margins, in the background, below the threshold of adult attention. This is not accidental. She has engineered her invisibility. Now, connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment affects different individuals differently, and if the mutations it produces can go in opposite directions, Homer and Maggie represent the poles of that spectrum. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to clinical disability levels. Maggie's mutation amplified hers to levels that standard testing cannot measure. Same environmental cause, same family, same water and air and proximity to cracked cooling towers. But where the radiation took something from Homer, it gave something to Maggie, something extraordinary, and something she has had the wit to keep secret. Under the coma theory, Maggie's genius carries a different emotional weight. If Homer is dreaming, If every episode is a product of an unconscious mind trying to preserve what it loves, then Maggie's extraordinary capability is Homer's deepest hope for his youngest child given form. He cannot watch her grow up. He cannot see her become whoever she becomes. He cannot protect her from the future that will arrive when he's not there. So, in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her the intelligence to protect herself, to navigate whatever comes, to be the kind of person who doesn't need protecting because she is, quietly and invisibly, the most capable person in any room she enters. Her genius in this reading is a father's prayer, the dream doing what the dreamer cannot. But in the waking world of Springfield, if there still is a waking world, the reading is simpler and stranger. Maggie doesn't speak because she has decided not to speak. She doesn't reveal her intelligence because intelligence is penalized in this town. She watches everything. She understands everything. She is, right now, probably the most dangerous individual on Evergreen Terrace. And she is waiting. For what? The show has never said. Maggie's endgame is the last genuinely unsolved mystery of the Simpson family. We've seen what she can do in fragments, in moments, in the margins of other people's stories. She shot a man. She organized a cohort of infants against an authoritarian institution. She navigated a security system with a plan that most adults would struggle to execute. She has the intelligence, the patience, and the strategic discipline to do whatever she decides to do. She just hasn't decided yet. And the fact that she hasn't, the fact that 36 years of extraordinary capability have been deployed quietly, selectively, below the radar, suggests that when she does decide, the decision will be significant. And nobody in Springfield will see it coming, because that is precisely how Maggie designed it. Number Section 7. The Skinner Revelation, How Springfield Maintains Its Impossible Reality. In the history of The Simpsons, a few episodes consistently appear at the top of every list of the worst the show has ever produced. These episodes are named, debated, cited as evidence of creative decline, analyzed for what went wrong and when. Among these episodes, one stands apart, not because it's the most badly written or the most tonally misjudged, but because it is, in a very specific sense, the most honest episode the show has ever aired. Season 9, Episode 2, The Principal and the Pauper, aired the 28th of September, 1997, written by Ken Keeler. The setup is straightforward enough, at least by Simpson standards. Springfield Elementary holds a celebration honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger arrives. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran. The real Seymour Skinner, who was captured as a POW, presumed dead, and is very much alive and standing in the Springfield Elementary Gymnasium, looking at the man who has been living his life for 2 decades. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a petty criminal from the wrong side of wherever, drafted into the army, placed in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian carried a guilt he couldn't process. He traveled to Springfield to inform Agnes Skinner of her son's death. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never had family or belonging of any kind, let her believe it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the identity, the mother. He built a life inside a borrowed life and lived it for 20 years until the original owner walked through the gymnasium door and everything unraveled. Here is what Springfield does in response to this revelation. The town holds a meeting. The evidence is presented. The truth is fully established in front of everyone. The real Skinner is present and verifiable. The imposter is identified and admits it. Every person in Springfield knows, with complete certainty, that their principal is a fraud. The town votes, not on whether to prosecute, not on whether to seek restitution or conduct a legal investigation. They vote on whether to acknowledge the truth at all, and the vote is unanimous. They choose the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree formalizing the fiction. Armin Tamzarian is legally declared to be the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war veteran whose identity was stolen, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge makes it illegal, under penalty of torture, to ever mention the truth again. This episode was universally despised when it aired. The backlash was immediate and has never fully subsided. Harry Shearer, who voices both Skinner and Burns, publicly expressed his objection. Critics argued that the episode destroyed one of the show's most interesting supporting characters by revealing his entire identity as a fiction. The Principal and the Pauper appears on virtually every list of the worst episodes in the series. It is cited constantly as the moment the show betrayed its own audience. But there's another way to read it. And this reading, once you've seen it, is very hard to unsee. The episode is being criticized for the wrong thing. It didn't break The Simpsons. It described The Simpsons. More than that, it described Springfield. It took the town's defining mechanism, the thing that makes Springfield function as an impossible place, and showed it to the audience in explicit, mechanical detail. Springfield has always operated this way. The town has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The town has always agreed, collectively and without discussion, to forget whatever doesn't fit the story it's decided to tell about itself. Every time something catastrophic happens in Springfield and is resolved by the next episode with no lasting consequences, that's not bad writing. That's the agreement. The town decided to forget. The town always decides to forget. The Principal and the Pauper is the one episode that shows you the machinery of that forgetting. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal mechanism. It shows you the expulsion of truth from the community. Every other time Springfield forgets, the forgetting happens off-screen, between episodes, in the space where consequences should live. This episode put the process on camera, let the audience watch it in real time, and the audience hated what they saw. Not because it was badly executed, because it was too accurate. Think about the inventory of things Springfield has collectively decided not to remember. The town has been sealed under a dome by the federal government. It's been rebuilt after destruction multiple times. It's survived incidents at the power plant that should have prompted federal intervention. It has experienced alien encounters, natural disasters, civil unrest, and the literal removal of the sun from its sky. And every single time, by the next episode, everything is normal. The radiation theory offers one explanation. The cognitive damage from long-term exposure has impaired the residents' ability to form and retain the kind of memories that would lead to sustained critical thinking about their environment. The coma theory offers another. Homer's dreaming brain resets between cycles because a dreaming brain can only maintain so many active threads at once. Old crises get cleared to make room for new ones. But the Principal and the Pauper offers a third explanation, and in some ways it's the most disturbing because it requires no supernatural or biological mechanism. Springfield resets because Springfield chooses to reset. The collective amnesia is a social technology. The town has developed, over decades, a shared understanding that certain truths are too dangerous to acknowledge and that the social contract requires their suppression. And when that suppression needs to be formalized, when someone shows up with evidence that the agreed-upon story is wrong, the community has the tools to deal with it. A vote, a decree, a railroad car pointed away from town. The real Seymour Skinner is Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He arrives with proof that the official narrative is false, and the town's response is to exile him and criminalize the truth he carries. That's not a comedy beat. That is a description of how communities function when they have agreed to protect their comfortable fictions above all else. Consider what would happen if Springfield actually remembered. If it acknowledged the dome and the radiation and the bones in the basement and the three-eyed fish and the billionaire who remembers the Spanish-American War. If it followed those threads to their logical conclusions and demanded accountability for what the power plant has been doing to the water supply for 3 decades, the economy would collapse. The town would lose its primary employer. Burns's empire would face scrutiny it has never faced. And the residents would have to confront the fact that they have been living, for their entire lives, inside a contamination zone that someone has been deliberately mismanaging for profit. Springfield cannot afford to acknowledge that. So Springfield doesn't. The Principal and the Pauper didn't show you Springfield at its worst. It showed you Springfield operating at maximum efficiency, using its most sophisticated social mechanism to protect itself from a truth that would destroy it. And if the coma theory is true, the episode takes on a third meaning on top of everything else. If Homer is dreaming, his unconscious mind invented a scenario where an entire town votes to sustain a fiction because that's what Homer's dreaming mind needs to believe. It needs to believe that lies can be maintained through collective agreement. It needs to believe that the fake version of a life can replace the real one, and nobody will ever come along to insist on the difference. Because that's what Homer's coma is, a fake life replacing a real one. a dream sustained by the willingness of the dreaming mind not to look directly at what it's doing. And as long as the town in the dream keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer's unconscious mind never has to confront the alternative. Armin Tamzarian is still walking the halls of Springfield Elementary under a borrowed name. Springfield is still pretending everything is fine. The real Seymour Skinner is somewhere out there, on a train heading away, still carrying the proof that the town's official story is wrong. Still the last honest man in a community that made honesty illegal. Number Section 8. The predictions: how a cartoon saw the future or made it. At some point in the last decade, it became impossible to scroll through any social media platform for more than a few minutes without encountering someone sharing a screenshot from an old Simpsons episode with a caption suggesting the show had predicted something that had recently happened. A news headline, a political event, a technology, a cultural moment. The Simpsons did it first. The Simpsons already knew. The phenomenon became large enough that it transcended the show's actual audience. People who hadn't watched The Simpsons in 20 years were sharing these clips. People who had never watched The Simpsons at all were engaging with them. The prediction mythology became, in some respects, more culturally prominent than the show itself. So let's go through what the record actually shows. The big ones first, because you've probably seen them. The year 2000. An episode called Bart to the Future depicts a future in which Lisa Simpson becomes the first female president of the United States. Her predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired in 2000, 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. The show depicted a Trump presidency as the absurd, logical endpoint of a particular trajectory in American celebrity culture, a joke about what happens when a society stops being able to distinguish between entertainment and governance. And then the joke happened. In 1995, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that could receive video calls and display information wirelessly, which resembles the Apple Watch closely enough to generate regular social media comparisons. In 1994, Homer travels to space alongside Buzz Aldrin, and the episode's depiction of commercial space travel echoes developments in that industry that wouldn't become mainstream news for another 20 years. In 1998, Homer encounters a mathematical equation that, according to mathematicians who subsequently analyzed the episode carefully, appears to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was experimentally confirmed in 2012. In 1993, an episode called Margin Chains depicts a flu virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, causes mass panic and hoarding, and triggers a frantic community response. The episode aired 27 years before the events of 2020, and during the fictional outbreak in the episode, the town accidentally releases a swarm of killer bees, which felt strangely relevant when Asian giant hornets began appearing in the United States in 2020, during the actual pandemic. In 1996, an episode features a scenario in which Cypress Hill, the hip-hop group, accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years separated the joke from the reality. In 1998, the show depicts Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox. The actual acquisition happened in 2019. The list is long enough to fill its own dedicated video, and it grows regularly as people find new historical parallels to add to it. The question that everyone asks when they encounter these is the same question. How? How does a cartoon from 1989 keep correctly identifying things that haven't happened yet? The people who actually make the show have an answer, and it's considerably less exciting than any of the alternatives. Al Jean, executive producer, addressed it with characteristic directness. He said, "If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes." Bill Oakley, who ran the show during some of its most celebrated seasons, put it similarly. There are very few cases where the show actually predicted something. Mostly it's coincidence, because the episodes are old enough that history tends to repeat. That's the official position. Volume plus time plus the cyclical nature of human events equals apparent prediction. Organizations dedicated to fact-checking popular claims have analyzed the most prominent supposed predictions and found, consistently, that most of them have simple explanations. Trends that were already visible when the episodes were written, technologies whose basic principles were already well established, political dynamics that were already clearly in motion. The writers of The Simpsons didn't see the future. They looked at the present more carefully than most people do and then extended the existing trajectory a few steps. The Trump episode is the clearest example of this. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since at least the late 1980s. He was a prominent figure in American celebrity culture who had actively cultivated a brand associated with wealth and power and ambition. The Simpsons writers looked at a very specific American tendency toward celebrity as substitute for substance, toward entertainment as a framework for understanding politics, and they asked, where does this go? The answer they wrote was Trump. Not because they could see 2016, because 2016 was already implied in 2000 by the trajectory they were observing. The Disney-Fox merger is similar. Media consolidation had been an accelerating trend for years before the episode was written, the specific details of which companies would merge with which were impossible to know. But the general direction, toward fewer, larger entities controlling more of the entertainment landscape, was clearly established and clearly accelerating. The writers made a joke about the logical endpoint of that trend. The trend reached its endpoint. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most formally educated in television. Multiple writers hold advanced degrees from elite institutions. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, hard sciences, computer science, and political theory. These are not people generating random guesses. They're highly educated observers of American culture, economics, and technology who spend their professional lives analyzing where current trends are heading and exaggerating those trajectories for comedic effect. They're not predicting, they're extrapolating. And their extrapolations are better than average because their analytical tools are better than average. This explains most of the predictions, but it doesn't explain all of them. Some of the coincidences are specific enough, detailed enough, precise enough that statistical probability starts to feel like an insufficient explanation. The Trump prediction didn't just forecast a celebrity presidency, it specified Trump by name and depicted him descending on an escalator in a sequence that visually echoes the 2015 campaign announcement almost exactly. That's not trend extrapolation. That's an oddly specific detail. The Siegfried and Roy episode didn't just make a joke about dangerous exotic animals. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is essentially exactly what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured during a performance. These aren't vague gestures toward general tendencies. They're precise, specific, idiosyncratic details that align with future events in ways that make you sit back and stare at the screen for a moment. And this is where the more interesting theory comes in. Not that the show predicts the future through any mysterious mechanism, but that the show shapes it. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced pieces of American media in history. It has been in continuous production for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. Its jokes have become part of the cultural vocabulary. Its observations have become part of how Americans understand and describe their own experience. When The Simpsons makes a joke about something, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point that they carry with them, consciously or not, as they move through their actual lives. When The Simpsons depicted a Trump presidency, that image became part of the cultural imagination of millions of Americans. Not as a specific prediction, but as a possibility that had been named and given a visual form. When the actual campaign began, and when the moment arrived, the response for a huge segment of the audience was not shock but recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The show didn't predict the event. It made the event feel, when it arrived, like something familiar. Something that had been in the cultural atmosphere long enough to feel almost inevitable. The show didn't forecast Disney buying Fox. It made that acquisition feel like the punchline to a joke the audience had already heard. When the announcement came, the cultural response wasn't astonishment. It was a kind of knowing nod. Of course they did. The Simpsons already told us. This is a different and more interesting relationship between fiction and reality than prediction. The show doesn't see the future. The show, through its enormous reach and its decades of cultural embedding, participates in making the future feel like it was already written. It normalizes trajectories. It makes outcomes that would have seemed shocking in isolation feel, by the time they arrive, like the resolution of a setup that's been running for years. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has been gradually shaped to resemble Springfield. through the same feedback loop that makes a joke about something eventually make that thing feel inevitable. And then there are the predictions that failed. There are thousands of them. Jetpacks that never arrived. Political outcomes that went the other direction. Cultural shifts that the show anticipated and that never materialized. Jokes about technology that seemed prescient when written and ended up being wrong in the specific ways that technology actually developed. Nobody shares those. Nobody builds a mythology around the predictions that were incorrect, because confirmation bias only works in one direction. We remember the hits. We share the hits. We build the narrative around the hits. And when you produce nearly 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about American culture, and then you filter all of those observations through one of the most powerful confirmation bias amplifiers ever built, which is the internet, you end up with what looks like a highlight reel of prophecy, but it's actually a highlight reel of the specific subset of observations that happen to align with events that actually occurred, extracted from a much larger body of observations that mostly didn't. The Simpsons didn't predict the future. The Simpsons wrote so many possible futures that some of them were bound to arrive, and the ones that arrived are the only ones anyone talks about. That's the mechanism. It's not supernatural. It's not even that unusual. It's just what happens when a brilliant, high-volume creative enterprise runs for long enough and is filtered through a medium specifically designed to amplify confirmation. But try explaining that to someone who has just seen a 1998 screenshot next to a 2019 headline that matches it in 4 specific details. Because even knowing how the trick works, it still lands every time. Section 9. Where is Springfield, the town that belongs everywhere? Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, Missouri. Springfield, Ohio. Springfield, Oregon. Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield, Virginia. There are something like 30 Springfields in the United States, which is roughly what you'd expect from one of the most common city names in American English. The name was chosen for exactly that reason. Matt Groening, the show's creator, named his fictional town Springfield because it's everywhere, because the name maps onto no specific place and therefore maps onto all of them. In 2012, Groening gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in which he more or less resolved the mystery. He said the name came from his childhood proximity to Springfield, Oregon. He grew up near Springfield, Oregon, and the name stuck. For approximately 48 hours, the question of where Springfield was located appeared to have a definitive answer. And then the show continued airing, and the episodes that followed the interview placed Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon, and the writers didn't honor the confession in any of the subsequent storytelling, and the mystery resumed exactly where it had been. Springfield exists in a state of deliberate and maintained geographic ambiguity. The show has provided enough location clues across its run to fill a dedicated wiki, and those clues point in every possible direction simultaneously. Springfield is coastal. Springfield is inland. Springfield is in the north. Springfield is in the south. Its climate ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within the same fictional calendar year. It borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. A visible ocean exists to the west in some episodes and does not exist at all in others. The state abbreviation has been depicted as NT, which is not a real state abbreviation. Lisa's area code has been shown as a Missouri prefix. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as beginning with a vowel, which narrows the field to 8 states but no further. The show gives you clues and then gives you contradictory clues and then gives you clues that contradict the contradictions, in an ongoing process of teasing resolution and withdrawing it. Most analyses of this phenomenon conclude correctly that Springfield's geographic impossibility is intentional. The show is set in a town that could be anywhere so that it feels like it could be yours. The specificity of a single-named state would have made Springfield feel like someone else's town. The deliberate ambiguity makes it feel like everyone's town. The strategy is for the audience to watch Homer drive to work and think, that could be my town, that could be my nuclear power plant, that could be the hill I drive past every morning. This is the surface-level explanation, and it's the correct one in terms of what the writers were consciously trying to achieve. But under the theories we've been discussing, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on additional dimensions. If the radiation theory is true, if the power plant's contamination has altered the biology and neurology of Springfield's residents in fundamental ways, there's no obvious reason to assume the contamination stops at biology. The Simpsons has always operated on a kind of expansive cartoon logic that doesn't need to explain itself. Mountains exist near coasts because the show needed a mountain for a particular episode. An ocean exists near the heartland because the storyline required a harbor. If the contamination has bent the rules for living organisms, why not for geography? This sounds like a stretch, but within the show's own logic, Springfield has always been a place where normal rules don't quite apply. The geography is just one more domain where the expected constraints have stopped operating. If the coma theory is true, the geography makes even more intuitive sense. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't have a precise geographic model of America. It has impressions, fragments, the accumulated visual memory of everywhere he's ever been or seen or imagined. The mountains from a family vacation, the ocean from a beer commercial, the desert from a road movie, the plains from driving through somewhere on the way to somewhere else. The dreaming brain assembles a setting from this catalog of impressions, layering them without regard for geographic logic, because dreams operate on emotional logic rather than cartographic accuracy. Springfield feels like America because it's made from one man's memory of America. A scattered, incomplete, longing-inflected memory assembled from fragments, not organized into a coherent map. The result is a place that contains all of America's landscapes simultaneously because it was built from all of America's emotional textures at once. If the collective denial theory from The Principal and the Pauper is true, Springfield's geographic ambiguity serves a very specific practical function. You cannot bring regulatory action against a town whose location you cannot definitively establish. You cannot organize consistent federal oversight of a nuclear facility if the state it's located in changes between episodes. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything in a jurisdiction that has no fixed relationship to any established legal framework. Springfield floats geographically because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a specific state attorney general. Landing means a specific EPA regional office with consistent authority over the facility. Landing means accountability with a fixed address. The town's geographic ambiguity is not a narrative convenience. It's a legal shield, maintained deliberately, that keeps the power plant and its owner operating in a space where regulatory authority is perpetually contested. The episode Behind the Laughter, the Season 11 mockumentary episode, provides the show's most direct geographic statement, and it manages to be meaningless in the most perfectly Simpsons way possible. In the original broadcast, the family is described as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed. The answer to the show's most persistent geographic question literally depends on which version of the episode you watch, which network is airing it, which year you happen to tune in. The truth is different depending on the platform. Even when Springfield has a definitive location, that location isn't definitive. It shifts, it mutates. It refuses to stay fixed, the way everything in Springfield refuses to stay fixed, the way the residents refuse to hold on to memories that would force them to confront difficult things. Every state in the Union has credible theorists arguing for it as Springfield's home. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence contradicting it. The show has spent 36 years providing just enough specificity to keep the theorizing alive, and just enough contradiction to keep any specific answer from becoming permanent. Springfield will never be located, not because the show can't decide, but because the show decided long ago that ambiguity is more valuable than resolution. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town nobody can shut down, regulate, or hold accountable. Because before you can do any of that, you need to know exactly where it is. Number. Section 10. Hans Moleman and the Saddest Man on Evergreen Terrace. Let's talk about Hans Moleman. If you've watched The Simpsons for any significant length of time, you know who he is. The tiny, nearly blind elderly man who appears in the background of Springfield scenes and exists almost exclusively to suffer. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed. He gets buried, incinerated, attacked by animals, struck by lightning. He walks into traffic. He falls into holes. He is, by any conservative estimate, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animated television. The show has killed Hans Moleman dozens of times. Not in the Treehouse of Horror Halloween episodes, which operate under explicitly non-canonical rules where death is a joke rather than a statement. In regular episodes, canonical episodes, Moleman dies and then appears 2 episodes later, completely fine, ready to be killed again, with no explanation offered and none expected. Most audiences process this as a running gag and move on. Molman dies a lot. It's dark comedy. Don't think about it. But if you apply the theories, Molman becomes genuinely strange. Under the radiation theory, Molman represents the most extreme mutation in Springfield. A man whose biology has been so fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear exposure that his body can reconstitute itself after fatal trauma. Not in the way Homer recovers from injuries, absorbing punishment and healing quickly. Molman actually dies. His body ceases function and then, by the following episode, is operating normally. Death in Springfield, for Molman specifically, appears to be a temporary condition. His cellular structure has been so thoroughly changed by whatever the plant has done to him that mortality works differently for him than it does for normal biological systems. Under the coma theory, Molman serves a different function. He's a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that the dreaming brain doesn't maintain with the same care it applies to the central figures. Molman lapses because the dream lets minor characters lapse. He comes back because the dream needs him to populate the next scene. He's furniture that breaks and gets replaced, over and over, by a brain that doesn't care enough about him to mourn him but needs him present for the scene to feel populated. Under the collective denial theory, Molman is another thing that Springfield has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, visibly, repeatedly, in front of witnesses, and nobody investigates. Nobody calls for any kind of inquiry. Nobody asks why he keeps coming back from clearly fatal situations. The town has normalized Molman's death cycle the way it has normalized everything else that should be alarming. He's just another piece of evidence of Springfield's extraordinary capacity for looking directly at something impossible and deciding it doesn't require attention. And then there's the detail that changes everything. Molman once stated his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him. His appearance suggests a man in his late 80s at the absolute minimum, more plausibly his 90s. He is physically frail, nearly blind, apparently ancient by every visible measure. If he is telling the truth, and there is no in-universe reason to assume he isn't, something has aged him catastrophically. Something took a 31-year-old man and turned him into what appears to be the oldest person in Springfield, something that also made him nearly indestructible, capable of returning from death repeatedly, apparently immune to the permanence that mortality usually implies. The radiation theory has a clear answer for this. The contamination affects different individuals differently, and for Molman it has accelerated some biological processes while fundamentally interrupting others. He ages at a rate that suggests decades of cellular deterioration compressed into a much shorter period. But the same contamination that aged him has also altered the biology of death itself, for him specifically, making it a door that opens and closes rather than a final exit. He is 31 years old. He looks 90. He has died dozens of times. He keeps coming back. And nobody in Springfield thinks any of this is worth commenting on. Now let's move to the character the show has quietly been destroying for the entirety of its run. The character whose relentless positivity is, once you understand what it costs him, one of the most disturbing elements of the entire series. Ned Flanders. On the surface, Ned is Springfield's moral exemplar. He's the good one, the one who does everything correctly. Devoutly religious, generous to a fault, genuinely kind, physically fit, financially responsible, patient in ways that defy ordinary human capacity. He is by every objective measure a better person than Homer Simpson, and by most measures a better person than most of the other residents of Springfield as well. The show rewards him for this with relentless punishment. His wife Maud was killed in a freak accident at the Springfield Speedway when a t-shirt cannon misfired during a race. Homer was dodging the projectiles in the stands, and they hit Maud instead. Homer's reflexive self-preservation contributed to the death of his neighbor's wife, and Ned forgave him. That's what Ned does. He forgives. But then an episode comes along that changes how everything about Ned reads. A hurricane destroys his house, the town rallies to rebuild it. The rebuild is so poorly executed that the new structure collapses immediately upon completion. And Ned, who has absorbed one thing after another throughout the entire series, who has turned the other cheek so many times the other cheek is raw, breaks. He snaps. He screams at the town. He calls out every person who has ever wronged him with a specificity that suggests he's been cataloging these grievances for years, maintaining a careful internal inventory of exactly what everyone has done and exactly how much it cost him. waiting for the moment when the accumulated weight would finally exceed his capacity to absorb it. He's institutionalized afterward, committed to a mental health facility, and in that facility it comes out. Ned's relentless niceness is not natural. It's the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being committed non-interventionists of the beatnik variety, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him, reprogramming him, building, through sustained therapeutic intervention, a version of Ned Flanders who could not express anger under any circumstances, whose default response to provocation and loss and injury was patience and forgiveness, and the assumption that everything was part of a larger plan. Ned's kindness is not a character trait, it's a cage. Built around a feral child by people who loved him but didn't know how to raise him, using methods that turned out to be more effective than anyone intended. The patience with Homer isn't saintly. It's pathological. The conditioning suppresses the anger not by resolving it but by rerouting it, turning it inward, converting it into prayer and good deeds and the performance of contentment that Ned maintains every day with the discipline of someone who understands, on some level, that the performance cannot be allowed to slip. His faith isn't spiritual conviction in the conventional sense. It's a framework, a necessary external structure for a man who requires something beyond himself to organize his responses to a life that keeps serving up evidence that the external structure is not working. His faith is what prevents Ned from asking the question that would undo him. If God is just and I am good, why does everything keep going wrong? And then there's the detail that hits harder than anything else. God talks to Homer. This is established canonical fact within the show's universe. Homer has had direct face-to-face conversations with God on multiple occasions. God has answered Homer's questions, offered guidance, engaged with him personally. The drunk who falls asleep in church, who eats donuts during safety drills, who threw a donut into a nuclear reactor to see what would happen, has a personal relationship with the divine. Ned prays. Ned prays constantly, consistently, with a devotion that never wavers across 36 years of episodes. He has dedicated his life to faith, to the practice of faith, to the community of faith, with a sincerity that is impossible to question. God does not speak to Ned. In the show's own universe, God exists, God intervenes, God has conversations, and God's conversation partners include Homer Simpson, an IQ 55 safety inspector who causes nuclear incidents with donuts. But Ned, who has given everything to the project of living righteously, who has absorbed loss after loss with grace born from genuine belief, who has maintained his faith in the face of every piece of evidence that the faith is not being reciprocated, hears nothing. That's not a theological accident written into the show's background. That is a thesis statement. The Simpsons is telling you, through the specific and deliberate contrast between Homer's divine access and Ned's divine silence, that the system doesn't reward goodness, it rewards something else. Proximity to chaos, perhaps, since Homer generates more of it than anyone. Entertaining company, since Homer is considerably more entertaining than Ned. Or perhaps the system rewards nothing in particular, and the relationship between behavior and outcome is random enough that drawing conclusions from it is a mistake. Ned Flanders is what happens when you do everything right in a system that is not organized around rightness. Homer Simpson is what happens when you do everything wrong in a system that is not organized around wrongness. They have lived next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them, the gap between trying and not trying, between discipline and chaos, between loss and casual survival, has never meaningfully closed. Because the gap isn't a gap in their character, it's a gap in the universe they inhabit. And the universe of Springfield has never been organized around justice. It's organized around Burns, around the plant, around the economic and social infrastructure that keeps everyone in their assigned place regardless of merit or effort or the quality of their prayer life. Ned is the saddest character on the show, not Homer, who is too cognitively impaired to fully experience his sadness. Not Lisa, who is young enough to still believe things might eventually improve. Ned, the man who tried, who keeps trying, who performs goodness with a discipline that should be, in any reasonably organized universe, sufficient, and who sits in his well-maintained house next door to Homer, and prays to a God who talks to Homer, and forgives a man who contributed to his wife's death, and wakes up tomorrow to do all of it again. The Simpsons is a comedy. But Ned Flanders is a tragedy wearing a cardigan. Number. Section 11. The floating timeline, why Springfield is frozen. We've arrived at the final mystery. The one that all the others eventually fold into. The one that sits at the center of 36 seasons like a patient and permanent fact, requiring explanation but resisting every explanation that doesn't ultimately reveal something larger than itself. Why doesn't anyone in Springfield age? We've already touched on this. But now, with all the other theories in mind, with the radiation and the coma and the collective denial and Burns's immortality and the predictions and the geographic impossibility all available to us, we can look at the question from every angle simultaneously and see what the combined view reveals. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989. He is 10 years old in 2025. Lisa was 8. She's still 8. Maggie was 1. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s. The math has always been impossible, and the show has never tried to make it possible. It simply asserts the permanent present and continues. Other animated shows have the same device. This is not unusual in animation. Characters on long-running animated shows don't age because aging means ending, and networks don't cancel things that are still profitable. The Flintstones didn't age. The Jetsons didn't age. Scooby-Doo's gang has been the same age since 1969. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the device has become something stranger than a production convenience. It has become, in the context of the show's own mythology, evidence of something that needs explaining. The show has shown us what the future looks like. In the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, the narrative jumps forward to show Lisa as a 23-year-old woman, engaged to be married, living in England, having become the kind of person the show always suggested she would become. Brilliant and principled and searching, and slightly isolated by the combination of those qualities. The episode is specific and detailed and emotionally full. It doesn't feel like a sketch of a future. It feels like a window into one. And then the episode ends and Lisa is 8 years old again. The flash forward is a detour, a glimpse through a door that closes immediately after. The future is available to the show as a storytelling device. It chooses not to use it except in carefully contained hypothetical episodes that are explicitly framed as possible futures rather than actual ones. The timeline doesn't move. The ages don't change. The permanent present reasserts itself every time, with the quiet certainty of something that has decided. Every theory we've explored tonight arrives at this point from a different direction. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist in the frozen mind of a man who last saw them in 1993. His reference for his children is the children they were on the day the vending machine fell, and the dream can only reproduce what the dreamer knows. The radiation theory says the contamination has altered the biology of aging at the cellular level, that something in the environmental load of living in Springfield has interrupted the normal mechanisms by which biological time passes. The collective denial theory says the town has chosen, through its social contract, not to acknowledge the passage of time, the same way it has chosen not to acknowledge the bones in the basement, or the three-eyed fish, or the fact that the principal isn't who he says he is. And Burns's immortality theory says that if one person in Springfield has successfully negotiated an indefinite lifespan through wealth and medicine and infrastructure, the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. The clock that runs for everyone else can be stopped for someone with sufficient resources. All of them say the same thing in different languages. Time doesn't work the same way in Springfield that it works everywhere else. Something has broken the normal flow. And the break has been so comprehensive and so lasting that by now it's not even clear that the residents know there's anything unusual about their relationship with time. Bart has been 10 for 36 years. He doesn't remember being 9, he has no expectation of being 11. The permanent 10 is not a prison he's aware of, it's just Tuesday. The backstory problem has become more visible as the show has aged. When it began, Homer and Marge's history was anchored in the 1970s and early 1980s. Their high school romance had a specific cultural texture. As the floating timeline has dragged the present forward, that backstory has become impossible. A couple in their mid-30s in 2025 cannot have met in a high school that felt like the late 1970s. The math doesn't work. So the show has quietly rewritten the backstory, multiple times. Each revision moves the setting forward, keeping the characters at the same age by moving their formative years closer to the present. The result is that Homer and Marge don't have a stable past. Their history is a living document that keeps being edited to fit the current moment. Their origin story has been told at least 4 different ways across the show's run, each version set in a different decade. They were defined by disco, then by grunge, then by the early internet, then by elements of the 2000s. The love story is the same in each version. The decade changes. The reference points change. The specific texture of who they were to each other changes. Characters without a stable past are characters without a stable identity. Homer and Marge's identities are anchored to each other and to their family, not to a fixed history that grounds them in time. They are defined by the permanent present rather than by an accumulated past, which is precisely what you'd expect from people living inside a time that has stopped moving. Now connect this to something larger. The Simpsons is the American family. Not a family, the family. They have occupied that position in the cultural landscape for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as the show depicts it, is not permitted to change. Homer must remain middle-aged. Marge must remain patient and beautiful and slightly underappreciated. Bart must remain the rebellious son. Lisa must remain the idealistic daughter who sees the world clearly and finds it frequently disappointing. Maggie must remain silent and watched and full of unrevealed potential. The dynamic must be preserved, because the dynamic is the product. What people watch The Simpsons for is not plot advancement or character development. It's this family. These specific configurations of these specific people. The moment Bart turns 11, the moment Lisa moves away to college, the moment Homer and Marge face the specific loneliness of an empty house, the show transforms into something else. Something people would still watch, probably, but not the same thing. Not the thing they came for. The floating timeline is not just a production convenience or a narrative device, or even evidence of the biological effects of radiation or the limitations of a dreaming brain. It's a response to the audience. The Simpsons has remained frozen in time because the audience needs it to be frozen. Because the version of America the show represents, the chaotic and resilient and frustrating and warm American family, is something the audience cannot afford to let end. And the way to ensure it doesn't end is to ensure the people at its center never grow old enough to face the specific losses that time eventually delivers to everyone. Homer and Marge have been married for 36 years in the real world, not in Springfield time. In Springfield time, they've been married however long it was when the episode they're currently in requires. But in the audience's experience, in the accumulative emotional relationship that viewers have built with these characters, it has been 36 years. And across those 36 years, we have watched Homer and Marge navigate the specific pressures of a marriage between two people who are genuinely different in important ways, and we have watched them find each other again and again after each navigation. We have a history with them that is longer than many real relationships. The loop isn't their prison, it's ours. We built it by watching. We reinforce it by returning. Every time we sit down and turn on an episode and settle into the familiar rhythms of the opening theme and the couch gag and the specific quality of attention that watching The Simpsons requires, we pull the loop a little tighter. We make it a little harder for time to start moving again. Because if time starts moving in Springfield, if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie says her second word, the show ends. And the show ending means acknowledging something the audience has been avoiding, quietly but steadily, for 36 years. That version of the American family was always fragile. That specific configuration of people in that specific house on that specific street was always temporary. The kids were always going to grow up. The parents were always going to age. The house was always going to become quieter, and then empty, and then someone else's. The thing we loved was never permanent. We just pretended it was, by pressing pause in 1989 and never pressing play. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we froze them. They're in the loop because we put them there, and we maintain it every week by watching. And every theory in this video, every buried storyline and every canonical mystery and every impossible thing that happens in Springfield and gets forgotten by the next episode, all of it comes back here. To a family on a couch, in a house, on a street, in a town that doesn't appear on any map. The same family, in the same house, on the same street, for 36 years. None of them any older. None of them any different, in the ways that matter, than they were on the night everything began. Maybe that's the real explanation for all of it. Not radiation, and not a coma, and not collective denial, and not a billionaire's medical protocol. Maybe Springfield is frozen because we need it to be. Because as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another day at the plant, we don't have to admit that the world we watched this show in, the couch we sat on and the room we sat in, and the version of ourselves that first laughed at this family, is gone, is changed beyond recognition, is further away than we expected it to get. As long as Springfield exists, unchanged, we can go back. We can sit down and turn on the television and find them exactly where we left them. A family that survived everything. That reset after every catastrophe. That found each other again after every episode's worth of adventure and misadventure and disaster and grace. A family that never had to say goodbye because the timeline never required it. The loop isn't a narrative device. The loop is the point. Number. Final section. Everything comes together. We've been in Springfield for 4 hours. We've walked every street and examined every dark corner and pulled at every loose thread until the whole complicated, impossible, beautiful thing came apart and we could see what was underneath it. The radiation theory and the coma theory and the collective denial theory and the immortality of Burns and the strategic silence of Maggie and the shooting that was never really solved and the location that was never really identified, the backstory that keeps being rewritten and the timeline that stopped in 1989 and never moved again. Every theory is different. Every theory starts from a different set of evidence and arrives at its conclusions through different logic. But every theory arrives at the same place, every single one of them, regardless of the path. Something fundamental is wrong in Springfield. Something that goes deeper than animation style or episodic storytelling or the practical requirements of running a show for 36 years. Something has broken the normal rules. Time, biology, memory, accountability, the basic relationship between cause and consequence that structures ordinary life, all of it works differently in Springfield than it works everywhere else. The show has been telling you this. Not through exposition, not through dramatic reveals, but through accumulation, through the slow layering of detail upon detail upon detail, across hundreds of episodes and decades of broadcast, until the picture that emerges is so complete and so internally consistent that it becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence or convenience. The nuclear plant is not a background element. It's the engine of everything. Burns is not an antagonist. He's the architect of the town's impossible conditions. Homer's cognitive impairment is not a joke. It's the symptom of a system designed to keep him exactly where he is. Maggie's silence is not developmental. It's a decision made by the most intelligent person on Evergreen Terrace. Ned's kindness is not virtue. It's the performance that a man conditioned from childhood cannot stop giving. The geographic ambiguity is not casual, it's protection. The aging stasis is not a cartoon convention. It's either biological mutation or a dreaming brain's limitation or a social contract or a response to what the audience demands. All of these things are true simultaneously. Or some of them are true and the others are compatible. The show was built to support multiple readings, and it has been doing so for long enough that the readings have become part of the show's fabric, woven in so thoroughly that it's impossible to separate the theories from the text. And underneath all the theories, underneath all the evidence and the analysis and the canonical citations and the fan arguments that have been running on the internet since forums were the internet, The Simpsons is something much simpler than any of this. It's a family. An imperfect, impossible, frequently catastrophic, irreducibly loving family. It's Homer, who is broken in ways he doesn't fully understand and doesn't need to fully understand because Marge is there and Marge is always there. It's Marge, who is stronger than the show usually remembers to say out loud, who holds the impossible thing together with the specific kind of patience that is born from genuine love rather than obligation. It's Bart, who is a rotten kid and a kid who loves his family more than he can ever directly express because expressing it would require admitting something he's not ready to admit. It's Lisa, who sees the world clearly and finds it frequently inadequate and keeps trying anyway because the alternative is giving up, and Lisa doesn't give up. It's Maggie, who watches all of it with eyes that understand far more than anyone realizes, and who is waiting still for the moment when understanding needs to become action. And it's Springfield. The impossible town. The contaminated town. The collective denial machine. The town that votes to forget. The town that expels truth on a railroad car. The town where a billionaire glows in the dark, and a baby ran a daycare rebellion, and an elderly man dies every 3 weeks, and nobody asks why. The town that exists somewhere in America, in every state simultaneously, in no state at all. The town that has been frozen in place since 1989 by the love of an audience that cannot let it go. Springfield isn't hiding its mysteries. It's showing them to you every week. Through the slow accumulation of 36 years of evidence, deposited in the background and the foreground and the jokes and the emotional gut punches and the throwaway lines that only matter if you connect them to 10 other throwaway lines. The show is not subtle exactly, but it's patient. It has always been patient. It has been laying this out since the beginning, trusting that someone would eventually look closely enough to see the pattern. Some people did. That's why these theories exist. People looked at Springfield and refused to accept the surface. They dug, and they connected, and they asked the questions the characters themselves cannot ask because the characters are inside the loop. And what they found, what we've spent 4 hours exploring, is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the one the show presents at face value. A version where Homer's stupidity is a scar from a system that broke him before he understood what was happening. Where Maggie's silence is the most sophisticated long-term strategic decision being made in any Springfield household. Where Burns's immortality is what unchecked wealth and unchallenged power actually look like when they run long enough. Where Ned's goodness is the saddest thing in town, not because goodness is bad, but because it's happening in a place not organized around rewarding it. Where Lisa's idealism is the only sane response to understanding the situation clearly and choosing to engage with it anyway. And where the whole impossible thing, the yellow faces and the 4 fingers and the cracked cooling towers and the coma and the shooting and the principal who isn't who he says he is held together by one thing that none of the theories can fully account for. The family loves each other. Homer loves Marge, in the specific, inarticulate, expressed through actions way that Homer expresses things, with enormous donuts and terrible decisions and the occasional genuine grace note that catches you off guard. Marge loves Homer, in the patient, steely, clear-eyed way of a woman who has made a choice and makes it again every morning. Bart loves his family in the sideways, deflecting, covered-up way of a boy who has learned that vulnerability is risky. Lisa loves them all so much it sometimes breaks her, because she sees them clearly and loves what she sees anyway. And Maggie loves everyone with the intense, silent attention of someone who has decided that watching over the people you love is worth more than talking about it. That's what's at the center of Springfield. Not the plant, and not Burns, and not the radiation, and not the coma. At the center is a family that loves each other in the specific, imperfect, ordinary way that families do, and that has been doing so, unchanged, in an impossible town, for longer than most of the audience has been alive. And maybe that's why we can't let them go. Not because they're funny, though they are. Not because the mysteries are interesting, though they are. Because they represent something we want to believe is true. That the family survives. That the kids are always young and the parents are always there, and the house is always warm and the couch is always big enough for everyone. That even in a contaminated town run by an immortal billionaire, even in a coma dream dreamed by a man in a hospital bed, even in the loop that never breaks, the people who love each other find their way back to each other by the end of the episode. Because in Springfield, they always do. Every single time. That's what we came for. That's what we stay for. That's what brings us back, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, to sit down in front of the same couch gag and the same theme song and the same impossible family in the same impossible town. They always find their way home. And so do we. Deep theories and forgotten corners. The forgotten storylines. Springfield never resolved. There is a specific kind of narrative satisfaction that The Simpsons occasionally promises and almost never delivers, and part of understanding the show as the strange artifact it has become involves cataloging the promises it made and then quietly stopped keeping. The show has introduced storylines across its run that carried the weight of genuine dramatic investment, setups that felt like they were going somewhere, character developments that suggested futures that never arrived, relationships that deepened to a point where their resolution seemed inevitable, and then simply stopped being mentioned. Some of these abandoned threads are minor, the kind of thing only devoted viewers notice, because they lived in single episodes and then disappeared into the continuity without leaving much trace. But others are significant. They're the kind of story developments that fundamentally alter a character's situation, that should, in any show with consistent internal logic, have lasting consequences. The show introduced them, gave them weight, and then moved on without a backward glance. The most significant of these is probably the Mona Simpson situation, which we've already discussed in depth, but it's worth noting that even within its own terms, the show's handling of Mona illustrates the larger pattern. She appears in Season 7 with a fully developed backstory that casts a long shadow over Homer's entire emotional architecture. She returns in later seasons. She dies, finally, in a moment of genuine quiet grief. And then the consequences of all of that, the way knowing about Mona and losing Mona a second time and understanding the connection between Burns and his mother's exile should fundamentally alter Homer's relationship with his employer, simply don't materialize. The storyline ends. The implications don't. This happens repeatedly. Homer discovers he has a half-brother, Herbert Powell, played by Danny DeVito in one of the show's most beloved guest performances. Herbert loses his fortune because of Homer's involvement in a business venture. Homer feels genuine guilt. There's an implicit promise of consequence, of Homer needing to do something about what he caused. Herbert returns in a later episode, having rebuilt his fortune, and the emotional thread from the first episode is effectively resolved through wish fulfillment rather than consequence. Homer doesn't have to reckon with what he did. The problem resolves itself. Apu and the Quick E-Mart. The show built a specific and detailed relationship between Homer and Apu across years of episodes. A genuine friendship with its own history and texture. When Apu's portrayal became the subject of broader cultural conversation, the show's response was essentially to reduce Apu's presence without addressing the conversation directly. A character who had been central to the show's social world gradually moved to the background, and the friendship that had been a source of genuine comedy for years became difficult to access. The show made a choice not to grapple with the question publicly, and the choice left a gap that remains unfilled. The relationship between Sideshow Bob and Bart. This is one of the show's most durable and most beloved running narratives. The murderous genius whose repeated attempts on a child's life have somehow never resulted in Bart's death or Bob's permanent imprisonment. The dynamic is played for comedy, but underneath it there's a genuine philosophical argument happening between these two characters, about intelligence and contempt and the specific kind of hatred that requires its object to be worthy of the hatred. The show has gestured toward resolution multiple times, in episodes where Bob and Bart reach a temporary understanding, and has always pulled back from anything permanent. The story keeps running because both characters need it to keep running. Without each other, they're diminished. But the show has never found a way to acknowledge that dependency directly, and the acknowledgement might be the most interesting episode the storyline could still produce. The Flanders children. Rod and Todd Flanders lost their mother. They are, by any standard, in a situation that should produce lasting psychological effects. They're being raised by a man whose own psychological cage we've already examined, in the specific and constrained way that Ned's programming allows him to raise children. The show has occasionally gestured toward the complexity of this situation and then moved on. What Rod and Todd are becoming, inside Ned's well-maintained house next door to the chaos of Homer's household, is one of the show's unexplored territories. The show seems to regard them primarily as props for jokes about religious childhood, rather than as characters with an interior life that might be interesting to examine. These abandoned threads are not evidence of incompetence. They're the logical result of the same device we've been discussing all night. The floating timeline, the episodic reset, the social contract that requires Springfield to forget what it cannot afford to remember. Stories don't conclude in Springfield. They run until they don't, and then they're replaced by other stories that run until they don't. The town doesn't accumulate consequences. It accumulates episodes. But the abandoned threads are interesting for another reason. They reveal the show's choices about what it considers to be the true emotional core of what it's doing. The stories that the show returns to, that it will not let go even when it might be narratively cleaner to move on, are the stories about the family, Homer and Marge's marriage, the parent-child relationships in the Simpson household, the specific texture of what it means to be this family in this town. These stories get revisited and deepened and complicated because they're what the show is actually about. Everything else, Apu and Herbert, and the full ramifications of Mona's history, is peripheral to that central concern. The show returns to the things that matter most to it and lets everything else gradually fade, which tells you something about what the show thinks of itself. Not a comprehensive portrait of a community which it pretends to be, but a portrait of one family, using the community as a backdrop, returning again and again to the same essential question. What does it mean to love these specific people in these specific circumstances, and how do you keep doing it when the circumstances keep getting harder? The economy of Springfield and why Burns always wins. There's an economic theory embedded in The Simpsons that doesn't get discussed as often as the character theories, but is, in some ways, the most straightforwardly honest thing the show has ever done. Springfield's economy is essentially a company town. The nuclear power plant is the primary employer, the primary generator of local tax revenue, the primary source of the economic activity that keeps every other business in town operational. Without the plant, Moe's Tavern closes because its customers lose their income. Springfield Elementary loses its funding because the tax base collapses. The retirement castle, the hospital, the local media, everything that makes Springfield a functioning community rather than an empty field depends on the plant continuing to operate. Burns understands this. Burns has always understood this. The plant is not just his income, it's his leverage. Control the plant and you control the economy. Control the economy and you control the politics. Control the politics and you control the regulation. Control the regulation and you control what the plant is permitted to do. It's a closed system that starts and ends with Burns, and every link in the chain is a link Burns either owns or has purchased. The episode where German investors buy the plant is illuminating in exactly this respect. The investors are portrayed as competent, efficient, and genuinely interested in running the plant properly. The first thing they do is assess the facility's actual condition. The assessment nearly bankrupts them. The cost of bringing the plant up to code is so far above what anyone had expected that the investors cannot absorb it. Burns buys the plant back because only Burns has the resources to operate an illegal facility and the infrastructure to keep the consequences from reaching him. No other entity can afford to own the Springfield nuclear power plant, not because the plant itself is expensive, but because operating it legally is financially impossible given its current condition, and operating it illegally requires the specific combination of regulatory capture, political influence, and community economic dependency that Burns has spent a century building. The plant can only be run by Burns. Burns can only be contained by the regulations his political influence has been specifically designed to obstruct. The obstruction works because the plant's economic importance to the town gives Burns leverage over the politicians who might otherwise enforce regulations. The leverage works because the town needs the plant to survive. The town needs the plant to survive because the economy has been structured, deliberately and over time, to make all other economic developments secondary to the plant's continued operation. It's not an accident that Springfield's economy is so thoroughly dependent on a single employer. It's a feature. An economy with a single dominant employer is an economy with a single dominant political actor. An economy with a single dominant political actor is one where that actor can shape the regulatory environment to suit their needs. An economy shaped to suit Burns's needs is one where Burns's needs will always be met, where the cost of challenging him will always exceed what any individual or institution in Springfield can afford. The show depicts this clearly enough, in individual episodes, that the pattern is visible. When characters try to hold Burns accountable, they discover that the mechanisms of accountability, the courts, the regulators, the elected officials, all of them have some relationship with Burns that complicates their independence. Not every character in authority is corrupt, but the system as a whole has been shaped by decades of Burns's influence until even the honest participants in it are operating within constraints that Burns helped create. This is why the shooting failed to change anything. Even if Burns had been killed by whoever actually shot him, the plant would have continued operating under new management. The economic dependency would have remained. The political relationships would have persisted. The regulatory capture would have continued because it was built into the systems rather than located in Burns's personal relationships. Springfield would have found another Burns, or the plant would have passed through institutional hands that needed it to operate just as Burns does, illegally and cheaply, because the alternative is economic collapse. Springfield cannot kill its way out of the situation Burns built. The situation is structural. The dependency is real. And the only exit from a structural dependency is the one that costs everyone everything they have before it costs them anything better. Springfield doesn't take that exit because no individual resident has enough to gain from the disruption to justify what the disruption would cost. Every rational actor in Springfield, evaluating their individual situation, arrives at the same conclusion. The plant stays open, Burns stays in charge, the contamination continues, because the alternative is worse for me right now than the current situation. It's the tragedy of the commons in its purest form, applied to a nuclear facility in a cartoon town. And it has been running at full operational capacity since 1989. The writers who tried to leave clues. One of the more interesting meta-dimensions of the theories we've been discussing is the question of intentionality. When the show includes an episode where God tells Homer that his time is coming, 6 months before the coma episode, was that a deliberate setup? Was the coma theory something the writers had in mind when they were writing that season 4 premiere? The answer is almost certainly no, but the more interesting answer is that it might not matter. The Simpsons has, across its history, been written by a very large number of very intelligent people who were paying close attention to everything the show had done before. The consistency of certain themes, the recurring patterns in how characters are written, the specific ways that the show keeps returning to certain emotional territories, these are not accidents. They're the result of a writing process that demanded familiarity with the show's own history and rewarded callbacks, continuations, and complications of established themes. When a later season writer includes a detail that rhymes with something from an earlier season, the earlier season writer didn't plant that detail for the later season writer to find. But the later season writer, familiar with the earlier material, was unconsciously or consciously building on patterns that were already in the show's fabric. The show talks to itself across its own history. It picks up threads not because a single author planned a 30-year narrative, but because the large and attentive collective of people who have written it across those 30 years share a common familiarity with the material and a common instinct to honor and complicate what came before. This makes the theories more interesting, rather than less. If the coma theory is correct in its reading of the show's arc, it's correct because the show's own evolution produced that reading over time through the accumulation of choices made by many different people who were all, in their own ways, trying to understand what the show was about and write in that direction. The theory reflects something real about the show, not because a single writer designed it, but because the show, collectively, kept moving in that direction until the direction was visible from outside. The radiation theory works the same way. No single writer sat down and decided that the power plant would explain everything. But the power plant is the most consistent element of the show's world, present in every season, referred to in hundreds of episodes, the source of Homer's employment, and by extension, everything that employment means for the family. The writers kept returning to it because it was central. And in returning to it, they kept adding details that, accumulated across 36 years, amount to something that looks very much like a portrait of what a town actually looks like when a nuclear facility is mismanaged for decades in it. The difference between a planned mystery and an emergent one is not that one is more interesting than the other. It's that an emergent mystery tells you something about the show as a creative enterprise, rather than just about the fiction it contains. The Simpsons didn't plan these theories. The Simpsons grew them, the way real places grow real mysteries, through the accumulation of time and attention and the specific texture of the lives being lived inside them. The sound of Springfield. There's an element of The Simpsons experience that the theories tend to underweight because it's hard to theorize about. The show sounds a certain way. The specific combination of Danny Elfman's theme music and the specific voice performances and the specific quality of the ambient sound design that makes Springfield feel like a place you've spent time in even if you've only ever watched it on a screen. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is one of the great vocal performances in American entertainment. The specific register of Homer's stupidity and warmth and occasional devastating sincerity is calibrated with a precision that makes it feel entirely naturalistic, even in its most exaggerated moments. The famous exclamation that Homer uses when he's frustrated, the extended version of D.O. that has entered the Oxford English Dictionary as a real word, is a piece of vocal artistry that sounds exactly right every single time. Across 36 years, in hundreds of different emotional contexts, Julie Kavner's Marge has the most distinctive voice in the show's cast. The specific raspy warmth of it, the way it conveys patience and love and exasperation in layers simultaneously, is part of what makes Marge work as a character. Without that voice, Marge becomes a patient cartoon wife. With it, she becomes a specific person. Yeardley Smith's Lisa is the other great vocal achievement. The way Smith calibrates Lisa's earnestness, keeping it on the right side of annoying without sacrificing the sincerity that makes the character emotionally effective, requires constant, precise judgment. Lisa is easy to write as a prig. She's easy to write as irritating. The performance keeps her from being either while maintaining all the qualities that make her interesting. The voice performances are part of why the show has lasted. You can imagine animated versions of these characters drawn differently. You cannot imagine them voiced differently, because the voices are what they are in a way that transcends the drawing. The drawing can change, and has changed, across 36 years of evolving animation styles. The voices anchor the characters in something that stays constant. And the music. Alf Clausen's scores, which accompanied the show for most of its history before a transition to a different composer in later seasons, were one of the show's most consistently excellent elements. The specific way the music could pivot between comedy and genuine emotion within seconds, could play something for laughs and then let a horn section turn it into something that caught you off guard with its beauty, was part of the show's distinctive texture. The music was always doing more than the scene strictly required. It was always adding a layer of emotional information that the dialogue and the animation were content to leave implicit. The sound of Springfield is part of what makes it feel real. Real enough to theorize about, real enough to care about the people in it, real enough that the mysteries feel like actual mysteries rather than narrative puzzles in a fictional text. Why we keep coming back. Every analysis eventually arrives at this question. Why does a show that began 36 years ago, that most critics agree has not been as consistently good as it once was for at least the last 20 of those years, that has been the subject of endless debates about whether it should have ended long ago, remain a living part of the cultural conversation? Part of the answer is inertia. It's hard to stop something once it becomes large enough. The Simpsons has been on long enough that stopping it would be a cultural event in itself, a news story, a moment of genuine public mourning, and the avoidance of that event has its own momentum. Part of the answer is the theories. The theories keep the show alive in a way that new episodes alone might not. The theories give people a reason to go back to old episodes and look at them with fresh eyes, to find new connections and new evidence for positions they've already taken, to argue with each other about what the show actually means. The Simpsons as a living text, as a thing that people are still actively interpreting and debating and building on, is more vital than The Simpsons as a show that airs new episodes on Sunday nights. Part of the answer is the family. We've been over this. The emotional core doesn't age because the emotional core is not about the plot, it's about the people. And the people are the same people they've always been, in the same house, loving each other in the same ways. But there's something else, something underneath all of that the theories keep circling without quite naming. The Simpsons is one of the few pieces of mass culture that is genuinely about the experience of ordinary middle-class American life in the specific texture of its difficulty and its warmth and its absurdity. Not aspirationally, not sarcastically, but directly. Homer's problems are real problems, dressed up in cartoon clothing, but rooted in the actual difficulties that actual people with actual families and actual bills and actual inadequacies face every day. The financial anxiety, the professional failure, the gap between who you thought you'd be and who you turned out to be, the specific negotiation of a marriage between two people who love each other but are also, sometimes, genuinely incompatible, the weight of parenthood. These things don't go stale. The specific cultural references date. The satire requires updating, but the emotional core doesn't age because the experiences it's built on don't age. People still lose their mothers and love their children and work jobs that feel too small for them and live in houses that feel both like home and like a trap and love the people next to them in the complicated, incomplete, practically expressed way that actual love gets expressed in actual lives. The Simpsons knows this. That's why it keeps running. Because as long as it keeps running, it keeps being there when someone needs it to be there. When someone's had the kind of day that makes them want to sit in front of the television and watch a family be a family. When someone's lonely and wants company that doesn't require anything from them. When someone's tired of the world being complex and wants 30 minutes of complexity that has a laugh track and an ending and a family that survives whatever the episode threw at it. That's what we come back for. The family that survives, the town that resets, the show that keeps starting fresh every Sunday night with the same opening theme and the same characters and the same house on the same street in the same impossible town. The theories matter because they make the show interesting, but the show matters because it makes us feel less alone. And that, in the end, is the only mystery that was ever really worth solving. Appendix: lesser-known theories worth your attention. Before we close entirely, there are a few theories that didn't make the main run of tonight's exploration but deserve at least a moment of attention because each of them adds something to the picture of Springfield that the major theories alone can't quite supply. The Lisa network theory, this one is subtle. The argument is that Lisa, across the course of the show, has been quietly building a network of relationships and resources that nobody else in Springfield has access to. She's maintained connections with every influential person she's ever befriended, from substitute teachers to foreign exchange students, to environmental activists, to jazz musicians, to Nobel Prize winners who appeared in single episodes. The argument is that Lisa is playing a very long game, that all of these connections, built across childhood, maintained through whatever mechanisms a preternaturally intelligent 8-year-old can manage, are preparation for something. An intervention she's been planning since she was old enough to understand the situation she was born into. Under the radiation theory, Lisa would be the most cognitively intact member of the family, a person capable of understanding what the contamination is doing and who is responsible. Under the coma theory, Lisa's network is Homer's dream expression of the belief that his daughter will have more resources than he did. Either way, the theory suggests that the 8-year-old playing saxophone in her room is not just processing her feelings about the world, she's getting ready for something. The Smithers as primary controller theory? The argument here is simple. Every major institutional function in Springfield ultimately runs through Smithers. He manages Burns's schedule, which is the most consequential schedule in town. He manages Burns's relationships with the political and regulatory apparatus that governs Springfield's civic life. He manages the medical protocol that keeps Burns alive. He manages the employment arrangements that keep the plant operational. And he does all of this, according to the theory, not as a loyal servant but as the actual decision-maker in the relationship. Burns issues directives. Smithers executes them. But execution requires discretion, and discretion is its own kind of authority. Every time Smithers decides how to carry out Burns's instructions, every time he chooses which call to take and which to defer, and which appointment to schedule, and which safety violation to minimize, he is exercising real power. The theory suggests that if you mapped the actual decision-making in Springfield, you'd find that many of the decisions people attribute to Burns are actually Smithers's interpretations of Burns's general preferences. Burns sets the agenda. Smithers runs the town. This would mean that the real power in Springfield is not the ancient billionaire who forgets his employees' names. It's the middle-aged assistant who carries his schedule and keeps him alive and manages his affairs with quiet, comprehensive competence that nobody in Springfield has ever examined too closely. The Patty and Selma conspiracy theory? Marge's sisters have always been the most openly antagonistic toward Homer of any recurring characters. Their hostility is so consistent, so comprehensive, and so specifically targeted that the theory suggests it's not just personality conflict. It's knowledge. Patty and Selma know something about Homer, or about what Homer represents, that makes them treat him with an enmity that goes beyond ordinary sibling-in-law friction. The specific version of this theory that has the most traction suggests that Patty and Selma were aware of Burns's relationship with Homer's mother before Homer was, that they encountered information at some point in their careers as Department of Motor Vehicles employees with access to certain municipal records that revealed the connection between Burns and the Simpson family history, and that their hostility toward Homer is not dislike but a kind of grief, directed at the most visible symbol of a system that they understand is broken in ways that Marge's family has paid for without ever knowing the cost. Under this theory, every time Patty or Selma undermines Homer, every time they side with each other against him or make clear in their comprehensive and consistent way that they think Marge deserves better, they're not just being difficult. They're protecting their sister from something they can see and she can't. The recurring dream object theory. This one is less a theory than an observation that accumulates into something that feels like a theory. Across the show's history, certain objects appear and reappear in episodes with a consistency that seems beyond coincidence. The bowling ball, the donut, the power plant's specific visual design, which appears in backgrounds of episodes where characters are nowhere near the plant, as though the plant's image has been seared into the visual vocabulary of the show's universe. The couch, which undergoes the elaborate variations of the couch gag every episode but always returns to its central position in the Simpson living room. Under the coma theory, these recurring objects are the deep structures of Homer's dreaming mind, the things so fundamental to his experience that his unconscious cannot construct a scene without them. The donut is the most basic unit of comfort he knows. The bowling ball is his approach to leisure, circular and heavy, and rolling forward without particular direction. The plant is the anchor of his adult identity, the thing that locates him in the world. The couch is home itself. When these objects appear in unusual contexts, outside their normal place in the visual world of the show, the coma theory suggests it's the dreaming brain losing track of where things belong. The fixed points of Homer's psychic world bleeding into scenes they don't logically belong in, the way certain images from waking life keep appearing in dreams, regardless of whether they fit the dream's narrative. Each of these lesser theories is a lens. Not the main lens, not the one that does the most explanatory work, but a particular angle of light that illuminates something the major theories leave in shadow. The show is large enough to support all of them. Springfield is strange enough to accommodate all of them. And the family at the center of it all is real enough, in the emotional sense that matters more than the literal one, that all the theorizing in the world doesn't change the fundamental truth of what you see when you watch them. A family, on a couch, in a house, in a town that shouldn't exist but does, every Sunday night, for as long as we need it to. The full history of Burns, a century of accumulated sin. Let's slow down here and do something the video format rarely allows. Let's take the entire history of Charles Montgomery Burns, as the show has constructed it across hundreds of episodes and dozens of seasons, and lay it out in sequence. Because when you read Burns's biography as a continuous narrative, rather than a collection of isolated episode details, what emerges is not a cartoon villain. What emerges is something that looks uncomfortably like an accurate portrait of how power actually consolidates and perpetuates itself across time. Burns was born into wealth. The show places his birth in the late 1800s, with specific dates varying depending on which episode you're watching, but the general arc is consistent. He was born into an already established family fortune. He did not build wealth from nothing. He inherited it, extended it, and has been extending it ever since through a combination of ruthlessness, intelligence, and the specific advantage that early wealth provides in the form of access, education, connections, and the freedom to take risks that people without safety nets cannot afford to take. He attended Yale. This matters because it tells you about the network he entered as a young man. The professional and social circles he moved in as a Yale graduate in the early 20th century were circles that shaped American economic and political life. The people he knew, the relationships he formed, the culture he absorbed during those years, these are the foundation of the influence he has exercised ever since. Burns didn't acquire power through charisma or innovation. He acquired it through membership in institutions that already had power and then used that membership to accumulate more. His involvement in World War II is consistently depicted as morally complicated at best. He served, but the details the show provides about what he did and how he did it suggest that his service was shaped by self-interest rather than patriotism. The trillion-dollar bill he stole from the United States government during the war is the most glaring example. Burns found a way to monetize a national crisis for personal enrichment and then spent decades hiding the evidence. The theft is treated as a backstory detail, a fact about Burns's history that the show uses for a specific storyline and then mostly leaves aside. But within the framework of understanding who Burns actually is, it's crucial. It establishes that there is essentially no limit, including national emergency and wartime sacrifice, that Burns will not cross for personal gain. After the war, Burns consolidated his energy interests. The nuclear plant was not his first industrial venture. The show establishes that Burns has owned and operated various industrial concerns across his long life. The nuclear plant is the one that survived, the one that proved most profitable, the one that established the specific relationship between Burns and Springfield that has defined the show's world ever since. But before the plant, there was the weapons laboratory that Mona Simpson and her group raided in 1969. There was whatever Burns was doing in the decades before that. The show doesn't fully trace the arc, but it establishes clearly that the plant is not the beginning of Burns's industrial career. It's a chapter in a much longer story. The weapons laboratory is worth returning to in this context, because it reveals something important about Burns's relationship to government oversight. The fact that he was running a biological weapons facility in a residential area suggests one of two things. Either the regulatory environment of the time was so weak that this was legal, or Burns had already developed the political connections to operate outside the normal regulatory framework. Given what the show establishes about his subsequent career, the second explanation seems more likely. Burns has always operated in a space where the normal rules apply to other people. The weapons lab, like the nuclear plant later, ran the way Burns wanted it to run rather than the way the law required. His response to the Mona Simpson raid reveals his psychology with unusual clarity. He could have decided that the lab had been compromised and moved on. He could have absorbed the loss, rebuilt the weapons program elsewhere, and continued. Instead, he reported Mona to the FBI and then maintained an active interest in ensuring she could never return to her family. For decades, Burns pursued a woman who destroyed one of his facilities for decades after the initial confrontation, using federal law enforcement as a personal tool and ensuring that the consequences for defying him were permanent and severe. The message this sends, which Burns presumably intended it to send, is that the cost of opposing Burns is a cost that continues to be collected long after the initial confrontation. You don't just lose the battle. You lose your life. You lose your family. You lose everything you would have been if you'd never crossed him. This is not a proportionate response to having a weapons laboratory raided. It's a strategic demonstration. It's Burns making an example. And the example worked. Nobody in Springfield has seriously challenged Burns since. The people who might be in a position to do so, the mayor, the police chief, various politicians, and business people, all of them have some relationship with Burns that makes confrontation too costly. The example Mona set, the example of what happens to someone who takes direct action against Burns's interests, has been sitting in Springfield's institutional memory for decades. It doesn't need to be spoken. It doesn't need to be referenced. It simply operates as background pressure on everyone who might be considering whether challenging Burns is worth it. Burns's relationship with Smithers began at some unspecified point and has outlasted everything else in Burns's life. The show has given their relationship different origins in different episodes, which is consistent with the show's general approach to continuity, but the duration and depth of the relationship is consistently established. Smithers has been with Burns long enough to know where everything is buried, in both the literal and metaphorical sense. He knows the medical protocol. He knows the political relationships. He knows the history of deals and compromises and cover-ups that have accumulated across Burns's career. He is, in the most practical sense, the custodian of everything Burns needs to remain operational. And Smithers has chosen to remain. This is the part of the relationship that most analyses underweight. Smithers is not held in place by contract or necessity in the conventional sense. He is capable of leaving. He has left in various episodes, and Burns's deterioration in his absence is always swift and comprehensive. But Smithers always comes back. He always chooses Burns over whatever alternative presents itself. Why? The show has offered the personal attachment explanation, the professional investment explanation, the sense that Smithers has built his entire adult identity around this role and cannot easily construct a self outside of it. All of these are true to some extent, but there's another explanation that the show doesn't quite state directly. Smithers stays because he knows too much to leave safely. A man who knows everything Burns knows about the plant and the politics and the medical protocol and the accumulated history of deals and compromises is a man Burns cannot afford to have operating freely in the world. Smithers's continued employment is his protection. The moment he left, he would become a liability rather than an asset. And Burns's relationship to liabilities is not characterized by mercy. Smithers stays in the cage because the cage is the safest place available to him, and Burns maintains the cage because maintaining Smithers is cheaper and simpler than the alternative. This dynamic, the mutual dependency that traps both parties in a relationship neither can easily leave, is one of the show's most honest and most uncomfortable portraits of how power operates at close range. Burns needs Smithers to survive. Smithers needs Burns to remain viable. The relationship that looks from the outside like devotion is, on closer examination, a bilateral trap. Two people locked together by the specific knowledge they each have about the other, maintaining the fiction of loyal service and benevolent employment, because the fiction is the only version of their situation that doesn't end badly for both of them. Burns's political relationships follow a similar logic. The politicians and officials who work with Burns are not simply corrupt, they have made calculations. The calculation, in each case, is that working with Burns provides enough benefit or avoids enough harm to make the relationship worth maintaining despite the costs. The mayor gets campaign contributions. The regulators get career security. The police department gets resources it wouldn't otherwise have. The relationship delivers something to everyone it encompasses, which is why everyone it encompasses chooses to maintain it rather than disrupting it in the name of abstract principle. This is not a cartoon version of corruption. This is corruption as it actually functions in real institutional settings. It's not mustache-twisting villainy. It's a series of individually rational decisions that aggregate into a collectively irrational outcome. Each participant in the network of Burns's influence is making a reasonable choice, given their individual situation and their individual risk assessment. The collective result of all those reasonable individual choices is a town where an over-century-old man with a leaking nuclear facility and 342 safety violations operates without meaningful accountability and has done so for longer than most of the population has been alive. The show understands this. It depicts Burns not as a unique aberration but as a structural feature, a character who could not have achieved what he's achieved except in a specific kind of place, with a specific kind of history. Springfield made Burns possible. Burns made Springfield dependent, and both of them have been sustaining each other ever since, in the closed loop we've been examining all evening. Number. Deep Dive Section. The Full Emotional Architecture of Homer Simpson. We've spent considerable time on the mechanisms of Homer's suffering, the crayon, the radiation, the maternal absence engineered by Burns, the deal his father made with the enemy, the cognitive impairment that prevents him from connecting the threads of his own biography into a coherent picture of why he feels the way he feels. But let's spend some time on what Homer is, underneath all of that. Because Homer Simpson is, when you strip away the comedy and the cartoon exaggeration and the theories about what the plant has done to him, one of the most fully realized portraits of a certain kind of middle-class American man that television has ever produced. Homer wants things that are very simple. He wants to be loved by his family. He wants to enjoy himself. He wants the specific pleasure of a cold beer on a warm evening and a game on the television and the sound of his children somewhere in the house. He wants Marge to look at him the way she looked at him when they were young. He wants to feel like he's enough. Not more than enough, not the best, not successful in any external measure. Just enough. Just sufficient. Just a person who matters to the people who matter to him. The tragedy of Homer's situation is not that these wants are unreasonable. They're not. They're among the most reasonable wants a person can have. The tragedy is that Homer's capacity to understand how to get what he wants has been so compromised by the crayon and the radiation and the childhood wound and the decades of accumulating damage that he keeps reaching for his happiness through means that work against it. He eats until he's sick because food is the most immediate available pleasure. He drinks because the fog is softer than the clarity. He performs the role of father and husband with genuine love and chronic incompetence because his model for both roles was built from a father who covered up the truth and a mother who disappeared in the night. Homer's love for Marge is real. This is one of the things the show never equivocates about, regardless of how absurd any given episode's plot becomes. When Homer loves Marge, the feeling is specific and genuine, and expressed in ways that are sometimes clumsy and sometimes unexpectedly beautiful. The episode where he realizes he can't sing her favorite song anymore because he replaced the memory with a beer commercial is one of the most quietly devastating things the show has ever done. Not because it's melodramatic, but because it's true. The small losses inside a long marriage. The ways we fail the people we love without meaning to and sometimes without even knowing we've done it. Homer's love for his children is equally real and equally expressed through incompetence. He genuinely wants good things for Bart and Lisa and Maggie. He genuinely tries, in his way, to be the father they deserve. The gap between what he tries and what he achieves is played for comedy across hundreds of episodes, but the gap is itself a portrait of something recognizable. The father who loves his children and lacks the tools to show it in the ways that would actually help. The parent who wants to protect and instead inadvertently damages. The gap between intention and effect that defines so many real relationships between parents who are doing their best with what they have. The thing Homer does better than almost any other character in the show is simply persist. He falls down constantly, across every episode, in every domain of his life. He makes the wrong choice. He causes the disaster. He fails the test. He embarrasses himself and his family and his employer and occasionally the entire town. And he gets back up. Not through resilience exactly, not through any conscious strategy of recovery. He gets back up because he has to, because the alternative is not getting up. And not getting up is not something Homer's constitution allows. This is played as comedy because Homer's persistence is frequently absurd. He persists toward goals that don't deserve the persistence. He applies the same dogged energy to getting a candy bar from a vending machine that he occasionally applies to actually important things. The persistence is not calibrated. It's just there, constant and undirected, the most reliable thing about him. But within the context of the theories, Homer's persistence is something else. If the radiation has damaged his cognitive function but left his emotional drives largely intact, then what you'd expect to see is exactly what the show depicts. A man who feels the full range of human emotional needs, who loves deeply and fears deeply and desires deeply, but who lacks the cognitive tools to translate those feelings into effective action in a sustained way. He persists because the feelings persist. The love for Marge doesn't stop producing behavior just because the behavior is poorly calibrated. The love for his children doesn't stop generating action just because the action is frequently counterproductive. Homer's incompetence is not the absence of something. It's the presence of something. Love and drive and the impulse to protect and provide, expressed through a filter that prevents it from reaching its destination cleanly. It's the signal trying to get through noise that's too thick to penetrate. And occasionally, in moments the show distributes across its seasons with enough care that they feel genuinely earned, the signal gets through. Homer does the exactly right thing for the exactly right reason. He saves someone who needed saving. He says the right words at the right moment. He demonstrates, briefly and usually without fully understanding how he did it, the version of himself that lives under all the damage. These moments are the ones the show's fans remember most clearly, across the decades of watching. Not the disasters, of which there are hundreds. The moments when Homer got it right, under the coma theory, these moments are the dreaming brain's fantasy of what Homer could have been. The unconscious constructing, in the space of an episode, the person who might have existed if the crayon had never been lodged in the brain, if the radiation hadn't accumulated across decades, if Burns hadn't driven Mona away and broken the family before Homer was old enough to understand what was happening. The moments when Homer gets it exactly right are the moments the dream shows him who he would have been. And then the episode ends, and he goes back to being who he is, and the show continues, because the dream cannot sustain the better version indefinitely. It can only visit it, but it keeps visiting. Every season, every few episodes, Homer gets it right, and the audience catches its breath, and the loop continues. Number. Deep dive section. Marge Simpson, the most underwritten character in a show full of underwritten characters. This is a criticism The Simpsons has faced consistently across its run, and it's one the show itself has occasionally acknowledged. Marge Simpson is, for a character who has been a primary figure in one of the most analyzed shows in television history, relatively unexplored. The argument made by critics and fans across decades is that Marge exists primarily in relation to Homer. She is defined by her patience with him, her love for him, her periodic frustration with him, and her consistent choice to remain with him despite all of the evidence that this choice makes her life harder than it needed to be. What Marge wants for herself, as a person rather than as a wife and mother, is something the show visits occasionally and then retreats from, never quite committing to a portrait of Marge Simpson as a fully autonomous individual. This is partly accurate. Marge's episodes, when she's the protagonist, tend to follow one of a limited number of patterns. She develops an interest or a passion or a capability that the show treats as unexpected, because the frame is that Marge is primarily defined by domesticity. She pursues the interest for one episode. The interest is usually resolved or abandoned by the episode's end. Marge goes back to the house and the kitchen and the children and the husband. The pattern repeats, but the critique misses something. Not because the critique is wrong exactly, but because it reads Marge as a failure to write a complete character rather than as a portrait of a specific kind of person making specific kinds of choices. Marge is not a person whose potential was limited by the writers. She's a person whose potential was limited by her choices, and those choices are depicted with more specificity and care than the critique suggests. Marge had a life before Homer. She had interests before the family, She was good at things that had nothing to do with domestic management. And across the show's run, in the moments when those interests surface, you see a person who is more complete and more capable than the role she inhabits allows her to demonstrate most of the time. The choice Marge has made is the family. She has chosen Homer and the children and the house on Evergreen Terrace with a completeness that means she is always choosing it, not just in the initial decision but in every subsequent day. The patience she shows with Homer is not the patience of someone who has given up. It's the patience of someone who made a decision and is committed to making that decision work in the specific and difficult circumstances the decision created. This is a portrait of a particular kind of person, not the kind of person the culture valorizes, the kind of person who sacrifices everything to pursue individual ambitions and finds fulfillment through achievement. The kind of person who makes a different calculation, who decides that the ambitions and the achievements matter less than the particular texture of the particular life they've chosen, and who then goes about building that life with thoroughness and care and the occasional devastating grief when the gap between what they chose and what they hoped for becomes undeniable. Marge is not a person who regrets her choices. She's a person who fully understands their costs and keeps making them anyway. That's not an incomplete character. That's one of the hardest characters to write honestly, because it requires resisting the narrative pressure to validate the character by having her break free, or by revealing that her choices were forced on her, or by placing her in a context where her constrained life is revealed to be secretly rich with meaning that compensates for its narrowness. Marge doesn't need compensatory meaning. She needs her family to be okay, and she needs Homer to occasionally understand what she's giving. The episode where she finally articulates this, where she stops being patient long enough to tell Homer clearly what his failures cost her, is one of the show's most emotionally accurate moments. Not because it resolves anything, because Homer doesn't become a better husband because of it, but because it makes Marge's interior life visible in a way that the rest of the show often doesn't. Under the coma theory, Marge is Homer's dream of the woman who stayed. Every fear Homer has about abandonment is rooted in his mother's disappearance, and the dream compensates by giving him a Marge who never leaves, who absorbs the disaster of being married to Homer and keeps choosing it. Not because the dream has made her incapable of leaving. The show depicts Marge as fully capable of leaving when the circumstances justify it, but because in the dream Homer gets what he's most afraid he doesn't deserve. He gets someone who sees him clearly and stays anyway. That's what Marge represents in the emotional architecture of the show. Not the good spouse, not the patient domestic helpmate, not the long-suffering wife of comic tradition, the person who sees you and stays. The rarest and most frightening and most valued thing that one person can offer another. Homer is terrified, always and in every episode, that Marge will eventually see clearly enough to stop staying. And she never does, and the dream keeps giving him that. Episode after episode, season after season, for 36 years. The one constant in a world that resets everything else. Number. Deep. Dive section. The children of Springfield and what they become. We've talked about Bart and Lisa and Maggie primarily in terms of what they are right now, frozen at their canonical ages in the permanent present of Springfield. But the show has given us glimpses, in flash-forward episodes and hypothetical futures and the occasional revealing detail about where each child's trajectory seems to be heading. Let's spend some time with those glimpses, and what they might tell us about who these children actually are and what they're becoming. Bart's future has been depicted several times, most completely in the Season 6 episode, Lisa's Wedding, which gives us Bart at around 30 years old. He is, in that future, a charming, unsuccessful person. Not unhappy exactly, but occupying a position in the world that is below his actual capability, in the way that charming people who peaked early sometimes settle into lives that don't quite challenge them. He's a drifter in that future. Good company? Not much else. But that future is an estimate made in the mid-1990s by writers who were extrapolating from what Bart was at 10. Bart at 10 is a rebel. He's the kid who can't sit still, can't submit to authority, can't do the work required to excel within institutions that he correctly perceives as broken. The rebellion is genuine, not just performance. Bart is one of the few people in Springfield who actually pushes back against the way things are, not with Lisa's intellectual rigor, but with the specific energy of a kid who simply won't accept that the rules are worth following, because the people who made the rules don't deserve the authority they claim. The flash-forward futures assume that Bart's rebellion burns out, that he becomes a slightly sad adult who never found a channel for the energy his childhood couldn't contain. But there's another possible trajectory. Under the radiation theory, Bart's physical resilience and his instinctive authority defiance could be features rather than bugs, survival traits that his contaminated environment produced for reasons the show doesn't articulate. A Bart who channels that into something, into advocacy or organization or some form of constructive rebellion, would be a very different adult than the drifter the flash-forward depicts. Lisa's future has been depicted most fully, and most of the depictions give her exactly what she seems to be heading toward: a position of intellectual and moral influence in the world. President, activist, academic, artist. Lisa becomes, in most futures, the show imagines for her. A person who continues to ask the questions that Springfield never wanted her to ask. Who keeps pushing against the comfortable fictions of whatever community she inhabits. Who is still lonely and still right and still searching for the connection that her specific combination of intelligence and idealism makes difficult to find. The loneliness is the show's honest acknowledgement that Lisa's kind of intelligence and Lisa's kind of moral seriousness are not qualities that most communities know how to welcome. She will always be the person in the room who sees the problem that everyone else is ignoring. And most rooms, most of the time, do not love the person who sees what they're ignoring. But Lisa's trajectory is the most hopeful of the Simpson children, because Lisa has the clearest understanding of her situation and the most developed tools for addressing it. She knows what Springfield is. She knows what the power plant is doing. She knows what Burns is. And she hasn't stopped knowing, hasn't chosen the fog the way Homer chose it, hasn't retreated into silence the way Maggie has. She keeps articulating the truth regardless of the cost, because that's the choice she made somewhere in her 8-year-old consciousness and has kept making every episode since. Maggie's future is the great unknown. The show has been careful not to commit to a specific trajectory for Maggie, because committing to one would require choosing between the various possibilities her intelligence suggests, and none of them are small. A Maggie who finally speaks is a Maggie who can no longer maintain the strategic advantage of her silence. Whatever she does first, when she finally decides to act in a sustained and visible way, rather than in the quick, invisible interventions she's been making for 36 years, will be significant enough to change the show's dynamics in ways that the writers have apparently chosen to defer indefinitely. There's a theory that Maggie's eventual speech will be the event that ends the show, not in the sense of cancellation, but in the narrative sense. When Maggie speaks, the loop breaks. The silence she has maintained has been the show's last genuine mystery, the last question about the Simpson family that hasn't been at least partially answered. When that mystery resolves, something essential about the show's relationship to its own unknowns will change. Which might be why the show keeps deferring it. The silence is not just Maggie's strategic choice, it's the show's strategic choice. As long as Maggie doesn't speak, the show retains the question of what she would say. As long as the question remains, the mystery remains. As long as the mystery remains, we have another reason to keep watching. Number, Deep Dive Section. Springfield's Media and the Manufacture of Consent. The Simpsons has depicted, across its run, a local media ecosystem that functions as a perfect closed loop of misinformation and normalization. Kent Brockman, the local news anchor, is the show's primary satirical target in this domain. He's vain, easily swayed, quick to adopt whatever narrative serves his immediate professional needs, and constitutionally incapable of the kind of sustained investigative attention that would be required to actually report on what the power plant is doing to the town he covers. Brockman has, in various episodes, reported on Burns's criminal behavior as though it were neutral news. He has covered environmental catastrophes in Springfield with the same tone he applies to local human interest stories. He has, most famously, been prepared to welcome what he believes is an alien invasion by immediately pivoting to collaboration with the invaders rather than reportage of the situation. The joke is about media opportunism and the willingness of journalists to prioritize their own position over journalistic principle. But within the context of the broader theories, Brockman's uselessness is also a feature of the system. A genuinely investigative press in Springfield would have broken the nuclear plant story decades ago. The safety violations, the radiation contamination, the disposal of radioactive waste in public spaces, all of this is exactly the kind of institutional failure that a functional local press exists to expose. The fact that it hasn't been exposed is not just about Brockman's personal inadequacies. It's about the structure of local media in a company town. Burns is the primary advertiser, through his various corporate entities, in Springfield's local media. Burns has relationships with local media ownership that the show implies but never fully articulates. Burns has, through the economic dependency we've already described, a leverage over local institutions that extends to the press. And in a community where the press depends on advertising revenue from companies that Burns either owns or influences, the press can be functionally controlled without direct censorship. You don't need to tell a local news station what stories to avoid. You just need to be important enough to their revenue that they self-censor in ways that protect the relationship. This is how press capture works in the real world, not through overt suppression but through the quiet structuring of incentives. Brockman doesn't spike stories about Burns because he's been ordered to. He spikes them, to the extent he's aware of them, because the calculus of his professional situation makes covering them too costly relative to the benefit. And because the calculus has always been this way, he stopped calculating at all. The not covering of Burns's most damaging activities has become automatic, a professional reflex rather than a conscious choice. The radio, the newspapers, the television news, all of Springfield's media outlets are operating within the same constrained information environment. The stories they tell about the town are filtered through an economic and political reality that makes certain truths effectively inaccessible to them. Not because the truths are hidden. The three-eyed fish was on the news. The radiation violations have been covered. The bones in the basement presumably would be, if anyone followed up. But the consistent follow-through, the sustained attention, the investigative commitment that would turn individual incidents into a coherent picture of systematic institutional failure, that's what's missing. And its absence is not an accident. Springfield's media creates and maintains the version of reality that Springfield's residents live in. It's not that the residents are being lied to. It's that the information they receive is carefully pre-filtered, pre-contextualized, pre-framed in ways that make the most damaging truths difficult to access. You can know that the fish have 3 eyes and not know what that means for the water quality. You can know that the plant had violations and not know that the violations were never fixed. You can know individual facts and still fail to see the pattern they form, if nobody in the media is doing the work of connecting them. This is the media's specific contribution to the collective denial system we discussed in the principal and the pauper section. The community didn't just vote to forget on that one occasion. It votes to forget every news cycle through a media ecosystem that systematically underweights the information that would make remembering impossible. Number, Deep Dive Section. The legal system of Springfield and why nobody goes to jail. There is a running joke in The Simpsons, so consistent it barely registers as a joke anymore, about the incompetence and corruptibility of Springfield's legal and law enforcement systems. Chief Wiggum is the show's primary symbol of this. He's lazy, easily bribed, professionally incompetent, and has no discernible interest in actual justice. He uses his position to pursue personal convenience, and his pursuit of justice is so sporadic and so poorly executed that Springfield's actual crime rate appears to be essentially unconstrained. But Wiggum is the surface. Under the surface, Springfield's legal system is not just incompetent, it's structurally captured, in the same way its media and political systems are captured. The mechanisms exist. The courts are there. The prosecutors are there. The legal processes are available. But they are available in a way that makes them accessible to people with resources and effectively inaccessible to people without them, which is exactly how legal systems function in real communities where wealth is sufficiently concentrated. Burns has been arrested in various episodes, charged in various episodes, brought before courts in various episodes. He has faced the legal consequences of his actions in the way that a man with extremely good lawyers and deep political connections faces legal consequences, which is to say, not at all, in any meaningful, sustained way. The charges get dismissed, the cases get settled, the trials produce verdicts that reflect the jury's inability or unwillingness to convict someone with Burns's resources. And Burns goes back to the plant, and the plant keeps running, and whatever the legal action was about continues unaddressed. This isn't cartoon exaggeration for comic effect. This is an accurate portrait of how the legal system fails when wealth reaches the levels Burns has accumulated. It's not that the law doesn't apply to him. It's that the law, as a practical system of enforcement, is sufficiently dependent on resources, on legal representation, on the ability to delay proceedings, to mount appeals, to leverage political connections in the pursuit of favorable outcomes, that a person with unlimited resources experiences the law as an obstacle to be managed rather than a force that can compel behavior. Homer's various legal encounters illustrate the other side of this. When Homer is arrested, as he has been in various episodes, the process moves at a very different speed. The presumption of guilt is more readily available. The legal representation is worse. The outcomes are less favorable. Homer navigates a legal system that is technically the same system Burns navigates, but practically a completely different experience, because his resources are a tiny fraction of what Burns brings to any encounter with institutional authority. The shooting of Burns is the most direct illustration of this dynamic. The investigation produced a verdict of Maggie's guilt, and the most compelling argument against reopening the case was not that the evidence was conclusive, but that the verdict was convenient. A baby can't be prosecuted. Nobody suffers any professional or personal consequence. The case is filed and the file goes somewhere nobody will look at it again. The system produced an outcome that caused the minimum disruption to everyone with power and authority within it, and that outcome was then treated as justice. This is the legal system of Springfield, not broken exactly, functioning exactly as designed for a community where economic power is sufficiently concentrated that the system's design reflects the interests of the concentrated power rather than the diffuse interests of the general population. The system works. It works for Burns. It works for whoever in a given episode has the resources to make it work for them. And for everyone else, it produces the kind of justice that people with limited resources have learned to expect from institutions that were never really designed with them in mind. Number. Deep Dive section. What 36 seasons of jokes actually tells you about America? We've been talking about the theories as though they're the most important thing about The Simpsons. They're not. The most important thing about The Simpsons is the jokes. The show is, fundamentally, a comedy. Everything we've discussed exists inside a container built from 36 years of jokes, from the couch gag to the closing credits, from the episodic plots to the throwaway lines, from the celebrity cameos to the recurring gags that have been running since the early seasons. The jokes are where the show lives. The theories are what you find when you look at where the jokes have been pointing all this time. And the jokes, taken as a collective body over 36 years, tell you something remarkable about America. About what America has been willing to laugh at, about the contradictions it's been willing to see in itself through the safe distance of fiction, about the critiques it's been willing to absorb when they come wrapped in a particular kind of cartoon delivery. The Simpsons has spent 36 years making jokes about corporate corruption, regulatory failure, political incompetence, media irresponsibility, economic exploitation, environmental destruction, and the specific ways that ordinary people are systematically disadvantaged by institutions designed to serve the people who already have power. These are serious subjects. These are subjects that, presented directly, as documentary or journalism or political argument, generate resistance and defensiveness, and the kind of tribal response that prevents people from actually engaging with the critique. But wrapped in Homer, wrapped in the couch gag and the yellow faces and the pacifier and the donuts and Springfield's specific cartoon absurdity, wrapped in jokes that make you laugh before you've fully processed what you're laughing at, the critiques get through. They become part of the cultural vocabulary. People who have never thought carefully about regulatory capture understand something about it from the way the show treats the power plant. People who have never analyzed media failure understand something about it from the way Brockman covers the news. People who have never thought carefully about the relationship between concentrated wealth and institutional accountability understand something about it from watching Burns navigate Springfield's legal and political systems. The show teaches by making you laugh. And then, for the people who keep watching, for the people who go back and look at the old episodes with the accumulated understanding of 36 years, it teaches something more. It shows you the pattern that the jokes were always pointing at. Not as a lesson, because the show is not comfortable with direct lessons, but as an accumulation of evidence that, if you're willing to look at it, draws a pretty clear picture of the world the show has been depicting all this time. The world where the plant always keeps running. The world where Burns always gets what he needs. The world where Homer always goes back to work and the fish keep developing extra eyes and nobody quite connects the threads. The world where the family survives, because the family has to survive. Because the alternative is too dark for even the Simpsons to sustain. And every joke that made you laugh, over 36 years of watching, was a small act of seeing. The show showed you something true and made it funny, and you laughed, and in laughing you acknowledged it. You said, yes, that's what the world looks like. Yes, that's how the plant operates. Yes, that's what happens when a man like Burns is left to run a town like Springfield without meaningful constraint. You laughed and you acknowledged it, and you came back next week. And so did the show, and so did the plant, and so did Burns, and so did Homer. The loop continues. Number. Closing reflection. The Springfield we carry with us. 4 hours is a long time to spend in Springfield. Long enough to go through all the theories, to examine all the evidence, to follow all the buried storylines and the abandoned threads and the canonical mysteries that the show introduced and never quite resolved. Long enough to see the pattern that emerges when you look at the show not as a collection of individual episodes, but as a continuous 36-year project with a consistent set of concerns and a specific and sustained vision of the world it's depicting. The vision is dark in the ways we've described. It's a vision of a community captured by concentrated power, of a population too damaged or too economically dependent to effectively resist that capture, of a legal and media and political system that functions primarily as infrastructure for the perpetuation of existing inequalities. It's a vision of ordinary people trying to live good lives inside circumstances that were not designed with their interests in mind. But the vision is also warm. Warmer than the critique suggests, warmer than the theories reveal, warmer than any intellectual analysis of the show's themes and mechanisms can quite capture. Because the vision is ultimately organized around the family. Around the fact that even in the contamination zone, even in the coma dream, even in the impossible geography, even in the town that voted to criminalize truth, there is a house on Evergreen Terrace where a family loves each other, imperfectly, constantly, in the ways they can manage, in the ways their limitations and their wounds and their cognitive impairments and their radiation damage and their decades of accumulated dysfunction allow. But genuinely. Homer's love for Marge is genuine. Marge's love for Homer is genuine. The love between the parents and the children is genuine. The love among the children for each other, expressed sideways and indirectly and sometimes through the specific cruelty that siblings who love each other use when they don't know how else to show it, is genuine. The Springfield that exists inside the contamination zone, inside the coma, inside the collective denial, inside Burns's empire, is a place where a family has managed to love each other for 36 years. In conditions that make love difficult, in circumstances that were specifically designed to keep Homer small and damaged, and incapable of the kind of sustained clear-sightedness that would allow him to see the architecture of his own suffering. And he loves them anyway, without understanding the full complexity of why he is the way he is, without being able to trace the threads back to their origins, without the cognitive equipment to build a comprehensive picture of the forces that shaped his life. He loves them with what he has. Which is, as it turns out, quite a lot. That's the Springfield we carry with us after 4 hours in it. Not the conspiracy, and not the contamination, and not the floating timeline, and not the bones in the basement. The family. The specific, ordinary, impossible family in the house, with the couch, and the television, and the yard where the dog sleeps, and the kitchen where Marge stands, and the bedroom where Homer snores, and the rooms where the children grow up without growing up. The family that survived everything the show threw at it, that will survive everything the show throws at it next. That will be there, unchanged and unresilient and resilient, the next time you sit down and turn on the television and go home to Evergreen Terrace. Because the loop continues. Because Springfield doesn't end. Because the show will not let it end. And we will not let the show let it end. Because as long as it runs, we have somewhere to go that is always the same. Always the same couch. Always the same theme song, always the same family, frozen in time by love, preserved in amber by the audience that cannot let them go. The family is still there. They'll be there when you come back. They always are. The real relationship between Abe and Burns. A deal made in darkness. We touched on the deal between Abe Simpson and Mr. Burns earlier in the evening, but it deserves its own sustained examination because it is, in some respects, the key structural element that holds the entire Burns-Simpson conspiracy together. Without the deal, the conspiracy has no mechanism. Without the mechanism, the conspiracy is just bad luck and circumstance. With it, the suffering of 3 generations of Simpsons becomes something that was planned, maintained, and enforced by a specific contractual arrangement between a scared old man and the most powerful person in Springfield. Abe Simpson is not a sympathetic figure in most of the show's handling of him. He's a nursing home resident, a veteran with a wandering attention span, a father who was emotionally unavailable to his son during Homer's formative years, and a man whose primary contribution to any conversation is a story about the past that nobody asked for and that usually doesn't resolve into a meaningful point. He's a figure of affectionate mockery, the old man who nobody quite takes seriously. But the deal Abe made with Burns reframes him, because the deal required Abe to do something that, whatever its justifications, was a profound betrayal. He knew something about Burns, something Burns needed kept quiet, and instead of using that knowledge to challenge Burns, to protect his family from the man who had destroyed his wife and forced her underground, he traded it for a job guarantee for his son. This is a transaction that could be read charitably. Abe was protecting Homer. He secured Homer's employment in circumstances where Homer, with his limited cognitive function and his emotional damage and his general inability to sustain conventional employment, needed protection. Abe gave Homer what he could give him, which was not the full truth about what Burns had done to their family, but the economic security to survive inside the system Burns controlled. The uncharitable reading is harder to avoid. Abe knew what Burns had done to Mona. He knew his wife was alive and hiding, forced underground by the man who now employed his son. He knew the full architecture of the situation, and he chose silence. Not the silence of a man who had no options. The silence of a man who calculated that speaking would cost more than staying quiet, and who made the calculation in a way that served his own need for stability and resolution more than his family's need for truth. Homer never knew about the deal. The show makes this explicit. Homer worked for Burns for years without understanding that his employment was guaranteed by a secret compact between his father and his mother's persecutor. He experienced the job security as a miracle of low expectations, as evidence that even someone as reliably catastrophic as Homer could somehow hang on to employment indefinitely. He didn't know that the employment was contractually protected, that Burns was legally obligated to keep him on, regardless of performance, because of what Abe knew and what Abe had agreed not to say. The discovery of this, if Homer had ever discovered it, would have been devastating in a very specific way. Not just the betrayal by Abe, though that would have been real. The revelation that his entire adult professional life had been managed, that the stability he thought he'd achieved through some combination of luck and the tolerance of his employers was actually a deal his father made, would have undermined one of the few sources of unambiguous positive feeling Homer has. He is, in his way, proud of his long tenure at the plant. He's worked there for decades. The continuity of the employment is part of his identity, and the revelation that the continuity was guaranteed by a secret contract rather than by anything about Homer himself would have been a specific and targeted kind of humiliation. The show didn't pursue this revelation. It introduced the deal and then left it in the background, available for the attentive viewer to connect to everything else but never elevated into a direct, dramatic confrontation, which is consistent with how the show handles most of the Burns conspiracy elements. The pieces are there, the connections are available, but the show will not organize them for you. It leaves the connecting to the audience, and in leaving it to the audience, it allows the show to maintain its tone while still providing the evidence that the darker reading requires. Abe made a deal. Burns honored the deal because honoring it was cheaper than the alternative. Homer worked at the plant for decades because the deal protected him, and the deal was built on the silence that should have been broken the moment Abe found out his wife was alive and hiding because of Burns. 3 generations of Simpsons, shaped by one old man's decision to stay quiet. The Treehouse of Horror as confession. Every Halloween season, The Simpsons produces a Treehouse of Horror special. These episodes are explicitly non-canonical. They operate outside the normal rules of the show's universe. Characters die and come back. Impossible things happen in ways that the show usually maintains a minimum of internal consistency about. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are the place where the show's imagination operates without constraint, where the writers can do things they can't do in regular episodes, because the episodes are explicitly framed as horror stories and fairy tales and science fiction scenarios, rather than as events in Springfield's ongoing reality. Or that's the official framing. The theory is that the Treehouse of Horror episodes are not pure fantasy, they are the show's confession. The place where it says directly, under the protection of the horror genre wrapper, what it can't quite say directly in the regular episodes. The things that are too dark, too explicit, too on the nose for a regular episode to contain? Consider the consistent themes of the Treehouse episodes. Burns as a monster, literally, in various supernatural configurations. The power plant as a source of genuine existential threat, rather than just chronic low-level contamination. Homer's incompetence reaching catastrophic proportions, causing the deaths of other people, causing the end of the world. The family in situations where the stakes of their dysfunction are made explicit rather than implied. Springfield destroyed by forces it failed to recognize as threats until too late. These are not random horror movie parodies. They're the show's actual concerns, elevated to horror movie scale so that the emotional logic becomes clear. In a regular episode, the plant's danger is background radiation and safety violations. In a Treehouse episode, the plant creates monsters. The threat is the same threat. The scale is different. The horror genre makes the threat legible at a distance that the regular episodes maintain through irony and comedy. Burns is repeatedly depicted as a vampire in Treehouse episodes. The vampire figure is a traditional metaphor for the predatory extraction of life force from a vulnerable population by an immortal entity that cannot be stopped through ordinary means. The show chooses this specific monster for Burns repeatedly and across multiple Treehouse entries. The choice is not random. Burns is a vampire in the Treehouse episodes because the Treehouse episodes are allowed to say directly what the regular episodes can only imply. Homer's various catastrophic failures in Treehouse episodes kill people. They end worlds. They bring about the apocalypse through chains of consequence that trace directly from Homer's specific combination of good intentions and comprehensive incompetence. In the regular show, Homer's failures are reset. The casualties are absorbed. The consequences don't persist into the next episode. In the Treehouse episodes, the consequences are allowed to reach their logical conclusion. And the logical conclusion of Homer's particular kind of failure, in a world without the reset button, is catastrophic. The Treehouse episodes are the show dreaming about itself, about what it would look like if the comedy wrapper were removed and the underlying situations were allowed to unfold without the protection of episodic structure and tonal management. The result is always horror. Not because the show has run out of ideas for jokes, but because the situations the show has been inhabiting for 36 years are, at their structural core, horror situations. A contaminated town, an immortal predatory billionaire, a cognitively impaired man as the primary safety mechanism for a nuclear facility, a family that loves each other too much to see clearly what surrounds them. The Treehouse episodes don't break the show's reality, they reveal it. Every October, the show takes off the comedy mask and shows you what's underneath. And what's underneath is what we've been discussing all night. The same Springfield, the same dangers, the same Burns and the same plant and the same Homer. Just without the jokes to make it bearable. And then November comes and the jokes return and Springfield is Springfield again and the horror is back where it belongs. In the background, in the water, in the air, in the cracked towers that keep humming. The music as a second narrative layer. The Simpsons uses music the way great films use music, which is to say not just as soundtrack but as information. The show's musical choices carry emotional and thematic content that the dialogue and plot don't always articulate directly. If you listen to The Simpsons with the same attention you give to its dialogue and its visual gags, you discover a second narrative layer that the show has been running parallel to the primary one since the beginning. The Alf Clausen score, which accompanied the show through most of its run, was built on a fundamental juxtaposition. The comedy scenes used the rhythms and textures of comedy music, the quick stings and the burlesque timing and the musical punctuation that tells an audience when to laugh. But the emotional scenes use something else entirely, quieter, more orchestral, more genuinely beautiful in a way that the comedy music never tries to be. And the transition between these two modes is where the show does some of its most interesting work. A scene can begin in comedy mode, with the music telling you this is funny, and then the music shifts, very subtly, and you realize you've moved into emotional mode without quite noticing the crossing. The joke has become serious. The laughable situation has become genuinely moving. And the music is what made the transition possible, leading you across the border before you were fully aware you were moving. This technique is most visible in episodes that are explicitly about emotional subjects, but are built around absurd comedic premises. The Homer and Marge relationship episodes, where the absurdity of their situation is handled comedically, but the emotional core of what's at stake between them is handled with musical sincerity. The Mother episodes, where the comedy of Homer's perpetual embarrassment gives way to something genuinely sad about loss and longing, and the specific grief of understanding too late what you had. The music is the show's confession, in the same way the Treehouse of Horror episodes are the show's confession. The music admits to the emotional stakes that the comedy framework keeps at arm's length. It says, "This is funny, yes, and it's also serious. The laughter is real and the sadness is real, and they're happening at the same time," which is the show's particular genius and the reason it has lasted as long as it has. When the music drops out entirely, which it occasionally does in the most emotionally charged moments, the silence is deliberate and precise. The absence of music is the show saying, "This doesn't need scoring. This is so real, so unironic, so directly emotional, that adding music would be a way of managing the feeling rather than letting it happen fully." The moments when the show is most honest about what it is, most direct about the emotional reality underneath the jokes, are the moments when the music steps back and lets the silence carry the weight. Lisa's saxophone is part of this musical architecture. Lisa plays the saxophone, which is not a typical instrument for an 8-year-old girl in most cultural contexts, and the choice of the saxophone over a more expected instrument is significant. The saxophone is associated with jazz, with improvisation, with the specific kind of searching, questioning, never quite resolved musical form that fits Lisa's character better than any fixed, structured instrument could. Jazz doesn't resolve the way classical music resolves. It keeps asking. It keeps searching. It circles around the same themes and finds different angles on them and never quite lands on the final answer. That's Lisa. And every time the show lets her play, the music is doing the work of characterization that the dialogue might not have space for. You hear the saxophone, and you understand something about Lisa that no amount of description could convey as directly. Theory: Springfield as every American city, the geographic politics of identification. The geographic ambiguity of Springfield is one of the show's most discussed elements, and we've already explored its functional dimensions, the way it provides legal insulation and enables the show's universal appeal. But there's a political dimension to the geography that deserves its own attention. Every American city has a Springfield. Not in the sense that every American city has a nuclear power plant with 342 safety violations, though some do. In the sense that every American city has the specific configuration of power and dependency and institutional capture that makes Springfield possible. The dominant employer who shapes the political and regulatory environment, the media that serves the economic interests of that employer, the legal system that functions differently depending on your resources, the collective tendency to forget what it would be too costly to remember. These are not unusual features of American civic life. They're standard features. The specific form they take varies. The billionaire's name changes, the industry changes, the nature of the contamination changes, but the structure is remarkably consistent across a wide range of American communities, particularly in places where a single employer or industry has achieved the kind of economic dominance that Burns has achieved in Springfield. The show's creators understood this when they made Springfield's location ambiguous. The fictional town is set everywhere because the dynamic it depicts exists everywhere. You don't have to identify Springfield with a specific place for the satire to land. You identify it with your experience of how power operates in real communities, wherever those communities happen to be. This is why the theories about Springfield feel applicable beyond Springfield. The radiation theory describes not just a fictional town but the reality of communities that have lived downstream from industrial facilities that prioritized profit over environmental compliance. The collective denial theory describes not just Springfield but the general human tendency toward comfortable fiction over uncomfortable truth. The Burns immortality theory describes not just a cartoon billionaire but the real-world phenomenon of institutional power that outlasts any individual and perpetuates itself through the mechanisms it builds rather than the people it produces. The Simpsons is satire. Satire works by making the specific into the universal. By taking the particular details of a particular situation and rendering them clearly enough that the general principle they illustrate becomes visible. Springfield is specific enough to feel like a real place, and general enough to feel like your place. Both at the same time, which is the trick the show pulls off in every episode. And the theories are, at their deepest level, the audience's attempt to articulate what the satire is saying, to name the general principle that the specific details illustrate, to say, this is not just a joke about Homer working at a nuclear plant. This is an observation about the relationship between institutional power and individual vulnerability. This is an observation about how communities maintain comfortable fictions in the face of evidence that the fictions are costing them something real. This is an observation about what a century of accumulated wealth looks like when it has no meaningful constraint. The theories are the audience doing the work of political philosophy through fan engagement with a cartoon, which is either deeply encouraging or deeply worrying depending on your view of the political utility of Simpsons discourse. But it's also genuinely interesting as a phenomenon. A show creates a satirical portrait of American civic life. The audience over decades develops theories that articulate the political logic of that portrait in ways that go beyond what the show says explicitly. The theories become part of the cultural conversation about the show, and through the show, about the civic life it's depicting. Springfield is everywhere. The theories apply everywhere. The loop is American. And the fact that we keep coming back to the show, that we keep theorizing about it and arguing about it and sharing clips from it and building mythologies around its apparent predictions, is itself evidence of something the show has been saying all along. We recognize Springfield. We recognize Burns. We recognize the power plant and the complicit media and the legal system that works differently depending on your resources and the community that agrees not to see what it cannot afford to see. We recognize all of it, and we come back to the show because seeing it recognized, even in cartoon form, even wrapped in 36 years of jokes, is a form of comfort. We're not crazy. Springfield exists, and somebody made a whole show about it. 36 years of being alive in the same moment. Let's end where all the theories end, at the show itself, at the thing the theories are theories about. 36 years of the same family. 36 years of the same town. 36 years of Homer stumbling through the same door, and Marge standing in the same kitchen, and Bart skateboarding past the same landmarks, and Lisa playing the same saxophone, and Maggie watching everything with the same knowing. Silence. The world outside Springfield has changed almost beyond recognition since the 17th of December 1989. The technology has changed, the politics have changed, the media has changed, the economy has changed. The culture has changed, several times over, in directions that were impossible to anticipate from the vantage of that first episode. The people who watched that premiere have aged, their children have grown up and watched it themselves. Their grandchildren are starting to discover it through streaming services that didn't exist when the show began. And Springfield stays the same. In one reading, this is the show's great limitation: the refusal to grow, the endless recycling, the permanent present that has become, over decades, a formal straitjacket. The loop that the theories keep describing is also, in this reading, the box the show has put itself in. The deal it made with its audience, never to change, has prevented it from becoming what it might have become if it had been willing to let its characters age. In another reading, Springfield's permanence is the show's great strength, the thing that makes it irreplaceable. In a world that changes faster than anyone can reliably process, where the technology and the politics and the culture are constantly in motion, where the reference points shift before you've had time to fully understand the last set of reference points, Springfield is stable. It's there when you need it. It's the same when you come back to it. It requires nothing from you except the willingness to sit down and let it wash over you. The theories we've spent 4 hours exploring are, in the end, love notes. They're the audience's way of saying, we've been paying attention. We've been watching closely enough to see the patterns. We care about these characters and this town enough to build coherent narratives around the details the show has accumulated. We're not passive observers. We're participants. We've made Springfield our own, through decades of watching and theorizing and arguing and sharing and returning. That participation is what keeps the show alive. Not the new episodes, though they continue. Not the merchandise, though it persists. The fact that people who watched the first episode in 1989 and people who discovered the show last year can meet in the space of the theories and find something to talk about, find a shared vocabulary, find a common mythology built from the accumulated evidence of hundreds of episodes of a cartoon family in an impossible town. Springfield is the longest continuously running conversation in American television history. Not just in the sense that the show keeps broadcasting, but in the sense that the conversation about the show has never stopped. The theories are part of that conversation. Tonight's exploration is part of that conversation. And every time someone shares a clip or argues about whether the show was better before or after season 8, or spots a new apparent prediction, or finds a new piece of evidence for the coma theory, the conversation continues. The loop doesn't just describe Springfield's relationship with time, it describes the audience's relationship with the show. We keep coming back, the show keeps being there. Neither of us ages in this particular regard. The version of ourselves that fell in love with the show is still there, accessible, every time we sit down and let the theme song begin. Homer Simpson is still stumbling through the door at 5:30. Marge is still standing in the kitchen. The kids are still the ages they were when we first met them. The town is still the impossible, contaminated, denial-addicted, love-drenched place it has always been. And we're still watching. Because Springfield is ours. Because the family is ours. Because the loop, whatever it is, whatever theory explains it best, holds something we need it to hold. 4 hours in Springfield. Every theory examined. Every mystery revisited. Every buried thread pulled up and held to the light. And at the end of all of it, the show is still running. Homer is still working at the plant. Burns is still in his mansion. Maggie is still watching. Lisa is still playing. The permanent present continues. Number. Bonus section. The characters we haven't talked about enough. Springfield's hidden architecture. There's an entire supporting cast of Springfield we've largely left aside tonight, and they deserve at least a moment of genuine attention. Because the theories about the main characters only fully make sense within the context of the supporting world the show has built around them. Springfield isn't just the Simpsons and Burns. It's a populated place, dense with recurring figures who each carry their own version of the story we've been telling. Moe Sislak operates Moe's Tavern, which has functioned across the show's history as Springfield's emotional pressure valve. It's where the failures go, where the frustrated go, where the people who need to not be home for a few hours go. Moe himself is one of the show's most consistently interesting recurring figures, because the show has built him as a character of genuine complexity, sitting underneath the comedy of his ugliness and his mendacity and his perpetual loneliness. Moe is lonely. Comprehensively, definitionally lonely, in a way the show doesn't always frame as comedy. He has wanted love and failed to find it across every season of the show's run. He has attempted and failed at relationships in ways that reveal not just social incompetence, but a depth of feeling that his appearance and his social position and his professional environment have never allowed him to express in ways that connect with anyone. He runs a bar, which is the perfect job for a man who wants constant human contact without the emotional exposure that genuine intimacy requires. Every night, the bar fills up. Every night, the same people have the same conversations. The closeness is structured and contained and can be ended at closing time. Moe is not happy in his role. He is not a man who found his calling. He's a man who found a position that gives him the semblance of belonging without its substance, and who has been occupying that position for so long that the distinction between the semblance and the substance has become difficult to identify from the inside. Under the radiation theory, Moe's physical appearance is the most extreme example of the show's contamination hypothesis among the supporting cast. His features are not just exaggerated for comic effect. They are, if you apply the same logic to him that you apply to the main characters, the visible result of whatever the environment has done to a man who has spent his entire adult life breathing the same air and drinking the same water as everyone else in Springfield. He is, in this reading, not a joke about ugliness. He's a symptom. Comic book guy, known canonically as Jeff Albertson, is one of the show's most transparent self-criticisms. He's a person who has dedicated enormous cognitive energy to the consumption and cataloging of media, who has developed an expertise in fictional universes that exceeds his engagement with the actual universe he inhabits, and who uses that expertise primarily to diminish other people's enjoyment rather than to enhance his own. He's the show's portrait of a certain kind of fan. The kind who has learned so much about what they love that they've forgotten why they loved it in the first place, and who have converted their knowledge from a source of pleasure into a weapon for maintaining superiority. The show is not kind to this portrait, but it's also not dismissive. Comic book guy appears consistently enough, and is written with enough internal consistency, that he functions as a genuine character rather than a flat satirical target. The show knows that this type of person exists in its audience. The show knows that some portion of its most attentive viewers have developed an adversarial relationship with the object of their attention, where loving something has become inseparable from finding it inadequate. And the show chooses to depict that figure with the same affectionate mixture of critique and recognition that it brings to all its Springfield residents. Sideshow Bob is the show's most intellectually distinguished antagonist, and his repeated failures are among the most interesting running narratives the show has maintained. Bob is brilliant. Genuinely, demonstrably, operatically brilliant. He has a deep familiarity with high culture in multiple forms. He is articulate, strategically sophisticated, and capable of the kind of sustained planning that most Springfield residents, with their radiation-impaired cognition and their collective denial mechanisms, are incapable of executing. And he keeps losing to a 10-year-old. The theory that Bob's failures are themselves evidence for the coma hypothesis is one of the more elegant connections in the show's extended mythology. If Springfield is Homer's dream, then Sideshow Bob is the avatar of Homer's anxiety about his son. Homer, unconscious and damaged and unable to protect Bart in the waking world, needs to believe that Bart can protect himself. And so the dream gives Bart a nemesis of operatic proportions who keeps failing, who keeps being outmaneuvered by a child's instinct and luck, who keeps losing to the kid because in Homer's dream the kid has to win. Bob doesn't fail because he's bad at planning. Bob fails because Homer's brain won't let him succeed. The dream needs Bart to survive, and so Bart survives. And every defeat of Sideshow Bob is another round of Homer's unconscious mind reassuring itself that his son is going to be okay. Chief Wiggum has been covered in terms of his function as a symbol of institutional incompetence, but his personal character deserves attention too. Wiggum is, in the moments when the show gives him genuine interiority, a man who knows he's bad at his job and has made a comprehensive peace with that knowledge. He doesn't aspire to competence. He has assessed the available options and concluded that the effort required to be a good police chief in a town where the primary power structure is controlled by a billionaire who would neutralize any genuine accountability effort is not worth the cost. This is not exactly corruption in the conventional sense. Wiggum doesn't take bribes, or at least not exclusively for that reason. He's not actively working against justice. He simply stopped working for it, in any sustained way, because he correctly intuited early in his career that working for justice in Springfield would be a losing battle against forces he couldn't defeat. The path of least resistance, which in Wiggum's case involves eating free donuts and napping in the squad car and performing the minimum required activity of a law enforcement officer while doing as little actual law enforcement as possible, is the path he chose and has maintained with remarkable consistency. Wiggum is, in a strange way, the most honest character in Springfield about what he is and what he's doing. He doesn't pretend to be a good police chief. He doesn't construct a narrative about his failures that excuses them or redirects the blame. He simply is what he is, openly and without apology, in the specific and understandable way of a man who made a realistic assessment of his situation and decided that honesty about his limitations was preferable to the performance of competence he couldn't actually achieve. Reverend Lovejoy completes a certain portrait when placed alongside Ned Flanders. If Ned is the man whose faith is a response to his psychological history, Lovejoy is the man whose faith has become a professional role that long ago lost its spiritual content. Lovejoy officiates. He performs the functions of a religious leader within the community. He gives the services and provides the benedictions and occupies the institutional position that Springfield's religious life requires. He does not appear, across the show's history, to believe anything in particular or to feel anything in particular about the deity he professionally represents. Under the radiation theory, this spiritual flatness is another form of cognitive impairment. The capacity for genuine religious feeling, for the kind of lived spiritual experience that animates actual faith rather than institutional participation, has been diminished in Lovejoy by the same contamination that diminishes everything else in Springfield. He performs the form of faith because the form has been professionally required of him, but the substance was lost long ago, so gradually and so completely that Lovejoy himself probably couldn't locate the moment of its departure. Lovejoy and Ned exist in a specific and uncomfortable proximity. Ned brings genuine spiritual need to a religious community led by a man who has lost the capacity for genuine spiritual response. Every Sunday, Ned sits in Lovejoy's church and brings his real questions and his real grief and his real desperate need for the divine conversation that never comes. And Lovejoy gives him the liturgy and the benediction and the institutional form of faith without any of the substance that would actually address Ned's need. The God who speaks to Homer and not to Ned. The minister who performs faith without feeling it. In the building where the most faithful man in Springfield sits every week and prays into silence. The community that has, in its medical and legal and political and spiritual institutions, constructed the perfect environment for ensuring that the people who need the most from those institutions receive the least. That's Springfield. That's the whole picture when you put all the pieces together and let them rest in their proper relationships to each other. The very last thing, a note on why we theorize. The theories we've discussed tonight are not all correct. Some of them are probably not correct in any meaningful sense. The coma theory, despite its elegance, contradicts itself in small ways when you push on it hard enough. The radiation theory explains everything except the things it doesn't explain, which is also true of every theory about anything. The geographic theories are fun but ultimately circular. The Burns conspiracy is probably the most internally consistent, but it too depends on the show sustaining a level of intentionality across its writing staff that is almost certainly greater than what actually existed. We theorize about Springfield not because we think we're finding hidden truths that the writers concealed. We theorize because theorizing is the deepest form of engagement we have with fictional worlds we care about. It's the way we process our care. It's the way we maintain our relationship with something that has been part of our lives long enough to have shaped how we think, and what we find funny, and what we find moving, and how we understand certain aspects of the world we inhabit. The theories are not about The Simpsons. The theories are about us. About the version of ourselves that fell in love with a yellow family in an impossible town and has been returning to them decade after decade as the world outside Springfield changed, and we changed, and everything changed except Springfield. The theories are our way of saying, we were paying attention. We noticed the patterns. We saw the consistency underneath the inconsistency. We understood that the show was doing something more than making us laugh, that it was building a portrait of something recognizable, something true, something that matters. And that's enough. That's more than enough. You don't need the theories to be correct for them to be valuable. You just need them to be honest responses to something real and important that a show has been doing for 36 years, and they are. Every one of them, from the most rigorous to the most speculative, is an honest response to something real and important. The Simpsons made us pay attention. The theories are what attention looks like when it's been sustained long enough. Good night.